Good morning and welcome to the 9th meeting in 2026 of the Finance and Public Administration Committee. We have received apologies from Craig Hoy. For the first item on our agenda today, we'll take evidence from the Scottish Fiscal Commission on its latest Fiscal Sustainability Perspectives report published last week. We will also take the opportunity to explore with the SFC issues to be included in a legacy report for our successor committee. I therefore welcome to the meeting Professor Graham Roy, Chair of the Scottish Fiscal Commission, John Ireland, Chief Executive, and Claire Murdoch, Head of Fiscal Sustainability and Public Funding. Good morning. And I invite Professor Roy to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Convener. And I just want to, first of all, start by giving my apologies on behalf of my two fellow Commissioners, Dr Eleanor Ryan and Justine Rucomini, both had prior appointments which clashed with this session. The report we published last week brought together our fiscal sustainability work with our 5-year forecasts to set the context for the next Scottish Parliament. It's a further development of our work to improve scrutiny as it brings together many of the themes that we've raised over the course of this parliamentary term. There are a number of structural issues which the incoming government will face. Our latest assessment is that the funding available to the next Scottish Government will remain tight. On day-to-day resource spending, current plans suggest average annual growth of just 1.1% in real terms over the next 5 years. And from 2027-2028, the government's capital budget is projected to fall in real terms. In contrast, the demand for public services is expected to rise. By the end of the next Parliament in 2031, we expect nearly a quarter of people in Scotland to be over 65 and 1 million people will receive disability payments. At the same time, we point out how policy choices that have taken place in this Parliament will have implications for the next Parliament too. The legislative targets, for example, in reducing child poverty by 2030 and seeking to achieve net zero by 2045 will all require additional investment. Particularly as interim progress reports point out that much quicker progress is needed if these targets are to be met. Alongside financial pressures, there's pressures in public services, particularly in the NHS and local government services, where we know that they've yet to fully recover to where they were pre-pandemic. Throughout our evidence sessions with you, we have discussed the size and the cost of the public sector workforce. Available evidence to date suggests some limited progress in workforce reductions and pay restraint, but we highlight the risks around the current Scottish Government's pay assumptions for 2027-28 when we published our forecast in January. Managing these pressures will mean difficult choices. Our report calls on all political parties to be realistic and open when making new commitments ahead of May election and to set out a clear and credible plan on how they will ensure fiscal sustainability. The new Scottish Government will need to explain how it intends to address these fiscal pressures, and it needs to be done in a way that enables the Scottish Parliament to debate and scrutinise the most effective responses. That leads me to the legacy issues which the committee have been taking evidence on in recent sessions. We agree with other witnesses who have stressed the importance of shifting the focus of budget scrutiny to the medium and long term. Issues around the presentation of the budget and budget revisions have made progress during this Parliament, but there's still work to be done. Ongoing questions of transparency and consistency around the budget presentation detract from wider issues of scrutiny and evaluation. Finally, I wish to thank the committee for its work and the support it's given to me and also the Scottish Fiscal Commission over the past 5 years. I'm conscious that some of you are returning, some of you are retiring, and I look forward to reading our reports on the beach. But I want to pay particular thanks to Michelle Thompson for particularly around the work around understanding Scotland's budget within the UK framework. You pushed us really hard on things like diversity, but also things like tax-based performance gap, and that's been really helpful and really welcome. And to Liz Smith, all your support around data, access to data, the questions around policy and activity has been really helpful and really welcome. And to John Mason, your healthy scepticism of any forecasts, projections, pay policy analysis has been really welcome. And I think our work has evolved since 2021. We now publish regular reports on fiscal sustainability and we've expanded our commentary on the Scottish budget. And all of these developments have been thanks to the support of this committee and the persistence of the committee in pursuing improvements in the budget process and making recommendations on how our work can better scrutinise has been really invaluable in improving how we operate as the independent fiscal institution for Scotland. Thank you.
In case I don't come back. I mean, unlike these folk, I've got to go in front of the voters. This is Michael and Patrick. Anyway, thank you very much for that opening statement. It's actually very helpful. There's a number of issues that you didn't touch on, or for obvious reasons I'll probably move to those first. I mean, one of the things you talked about, for example, in 1.23 in your report section, you said that the divergence in the thresholds has led to the number at which tax is paid, obviously, has led to the number of higher rate taxpayers in Scotland becoming larger and rising faster than the rest of the UK. You go on to talk about how just a few short years ago, people in the Scottish public sector were paid on average £400 a year more than they are down south. It's now £1,500 on average more. So is that having an impact in terms of the number of people who are moving into the higher bands? So they're getting paid more, but they're moving into a high rate of tax at the same time.
Yeah, so you're right, the big change that we've seen in tax policy over the last few years that has generated lots of revenue hasn't been so much about the additional rates and bans, but actually it's about the effects of fiscal drag coming through.
Well, sorry, I meant the fiscal drag in terms of threshold, yeah, of course.
Exactly, and you see that, and the particular effect that has is because of where the income distribution is, then you have more people in and around those kind of middle income parts. So if you freeze those rates for longer, then more people will move into that. And that now includes, relative to where we were in 2016, 2017, many more people who are working in the public sector. So if you look at average wages for a teacher or charge nurse or police constable, they're now around about that level where you start to move into pay higher rate tax bands. So for any pay awards that are done in the future from that base, if the thresholds remain fixed, then you'll have them paying the marginal increases of that pay awards at the higher rate, and the government will essentially recycle some of that back into the budget.
Okay. Because, I mean, the proportion of people who are actually going to be high rate taxpayers is going to exceed that of down south, whereas beforehand it used to be lower because of this.
Yeah. So the percentage of taxpayers who will be high rate taxpayers is now higher in Scotland than the rest of the UK. I mean, the UK are also freezing thresholds.
Of course, yeah.
We've frozen them lower and for longer. And the key thing is, I guess, that's how the government are raising revenue. So it's the government are choosing to do that in order to raise revenue to then reinvest in public services.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you didn't touch on capital in your opening statement. We're going to be talking about the infrastructure delivery pipeline in the next session. But you say in paragraph 1.50, you say in 2023 around half of the projects in the 2021 infrastructure investment plan had been affected by cost increases or delays. And I was first elected in 1992, and I don't remember a time when this didn't actually happen, not just in Scotland, UK, but elsewhere. So I'm just wondering where we are in terms of this particular issue. It seems to be almost built in, not deliberately, of course, but it seems to almost be that delays and cost overruns are almost de rigueur in terms of infrastructure investment. Is this a serious concern? Has this grown? Has it stayed the same? Has it got less? Become less of a problem in recent years? Where are we on that? And how do we compare Scotland to, for example, HS2, the rest of UK, whatever?
Yeah, I don't know, Claire and John might come in on some of the specifics, but in principle, yeah, there's always going to be delays, cost overruns, and particularly in major projects and complicated
There wasn't, for example,
projects.
with the Forth Road Bridge, so it's not an inevitability.
Yeah, there are other exceptions to it, yes, and there. But I think part of the general problem is that how this links into funding, and in particular some of the lumpiness of the funding coming through. And we've spoken before about the previous UK government's decision to front-load capital budgets into the early part of the spending review, and then to fall away toward the end of the spending review. And from a planning point of view, that is actually, it can be quite difficult, because you're then trying to accelerate projects with potential costs. You're trying to move them on quickly. But then, as you see from our work, the actual real terms capital budget falls over time. So the ability to plan out a pipeline of investment isn't just about what you do on the spending side of things, but it's about what's the overall projections in terms of the funding. And that's where it gets quite tricky.
Yeah, and I mean, and in paragraph 1.51, you point out 93.5% of the Scottish capital budget is effectively from Westminster, so we're basically at the mercy of decisions taken there, which is something that's obviously a big feature of your presentation, last Thursday. So that if we are having a real terms reduction in capital, I think we all accept that. I think it's probably deeper in real terms than you say, because we use a GDP deflator, as we've talked about before. But that just means that if there are delays and cost overruns, it's even more, it has even more of an adverse impact on maintenance and new capital projects, is it not?
Yeah, and the government can try and smoother this, of course, through what they do on the capital borrowing side. So they can, and that's what they've done historically. They've lifted that up and down based upon particular trends and where that's going. But I think, again, that's one of the things that we highlight in terms of what the next Parliament will have to deal with. It has got big commitments and big plans. Current government has got big plans on infrastructure, some big projects that need to be delivered. But if you look at the current funding projections, then that means that they're going to have to be, really careful prioritisation, and some projects will not be able to go ahead if the overall budget is declining in real terms.
I mean, one of the things you've talked about in terms of the devolved public sector workforce, 468,000 full-time equivalents, and how that's grown by 100,000 or so under devolution. Now, there have been some extra powers that have been devolved, which accounts for that, but a lot of it's NHS, ageing population, needs a larger workforce, etc., etc. People become older and frailer and need more support. But one area you've highlighted at 2.7 is a reduction in the workforce of police and fire from 28,500, for example, 12 years ago to 26,675. But would one not expect that anyway? You went from one police board to 8, so you don't have 8 headquarters with all the kind of infrastructure. That means 8 chief constables, 8 deputy chief constables, and all that. Is it not? Is that kind of merging of funding streams to be more efficient by having larger overall bodies, not a way in which the Scottish Government should perhaps go if they're trying to reduce the workforce by the 13,600 they aim to do? Yeah.
So part of it is right. Yeah. So there has been efficiencies and rationalisation, which has come into things like police and fire. The key part of that, I think, is actually then coming back to what's been happening to the budgets overall, and we know that. That again, we talked about early on in the report about the funding being relatively tight through the current parliamentary term. If you prioritise health and social security, then it's arithmetic that other areas have to pick up the slack in there. So that's why you see particular things like local government, the justice budgets. They are naturally going to have less growth or find some savings in order to prioritise into other areas. So then you see the falls in the workforce. Again, the broader point that we talk about in the workforce is that probably two things. One is that the ambitions to shrink the size of the public sector are different from the trends we've seen since devolution. That's quite a different approach. There's a big question about how do you do that, and what are the potential implications of doing that. And secondly, how do you do that strategically? So we've heard about prioritising non-frontline workers. But what is a non-frontline worker, and how might a non-frontline worker impact upon services? We can probably all list who we think is frontline workers, nurses, teachers, etc. But it's what else sits around there that is needed to deliver public services, and how do you concentrate and do that in a strategic way that fits with your ambitions around public service reform and prioritisation of key portfolios?
Yeah, I'm not convinced such labels are helpful, frankly, because I think one can't work without the other. It's always about a team approach, I would have thought. Now, you started your opening statement by talking about growth, and it seemed quite pessimistic. So both the UK and Scottish governments are committed to growing the economy, but you're expecting only about 1.1% over 5 years. Pre-crash, it was averaged 2.9%, which seems kind of almost like the sunny uplands compared to where we've been for the last 15, 16 years. So there seems to be there's a clash. I mean, you talk in the paper that as we move forward, the workforce relative to the dependent workforce is going to decline because of a demographic change, etc., etc. But at the same time, we've also got new technology. So, I mean, I appreciate that if folk are working in social care, it's a lot more difficult to increase productivity, perhaps, in some kind of advanced manufacturing facility. But why do you feel that growth is going to be stuck on that 1.1? I mean, is there no way to escape that kind of fairly depressing trend?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, it's actually quite. I mean, when I was when we're looking at the data and stuff, that chart that we have in there about living standards and how living standards in the first decade of devolution growing at about 3% a year in real terms, and then ever since then growing at around about less than 1% on average each year since then, is quite stark. And you can see that is some of the broader challenges that we have around poverty, around high quality jobs, around ability to generate tax revenues for investment. That's the reason why we're in the situation, is the challenges that we've had in terms of growth within the economy. And it's not just unique to Scotland. I mean, this is a challenge that is facing most high-income economies. Some of it is demographics, you're right, is the ageing of the population. But the key thing is the weakness in growth and productivity. And as economists, we've all been thinking that it will bounce back at some point, but it hasn't bounced back yet. So the next hope is that tech will be the sort of thing that will get our productivity coming back up and running. And there's lots of policy work. The UK Government Industrial Strategy is really trying to focus in on this. Scottish Government is doing similar things as well around there. The thing about tech, and I guess the bit where we don't know where it will go and what the effects will be, is how much is the revolution in AI, how much is the shift into tech, and what we call labour enhancing or labour replacing. So how much of it will make us more effective at what we're doing, which can then lead to improvements and faster economic growth, or how much of it will just replace what we're doing. And then the effects will essentially cancel each other out. And you have to look at the stock market of some big companies at the moment to know that people have placed a big bet on the first of these that will be labour enhancing. You probably only have to look at the stock market prices in recent times to know that actually some people might be taking a slightly different view and concern about actually whether or not the payoff will be as big as we had hoped.
Yeah, there's also the issue about broadening the tax base. I might go into that in a few minutes. But I have to say, I found it really, really quite touching when you said in Chapter 3.1, and you reiterated this morning, that political parties need to be clear about what the Scottish Government can afford and the impact on public spending for people in Scotland. Manifestos should make clear if any additional spending commitments set out would need cuts to other areas of spending or raise more revenue to fund them. So...
Yeah,
so that was I just thought it was quite sweet and innocent of you really, to say that. That was,
so we get to hold you to account.
Sorry?
The ballot box. So.
I mean, I know our manifesto will meet that criteria, but
But there is an important, I guess, I noticed that there is a really important principle about...
Yes, there is actually.
About actually the... I think the 2 points we make, one is about, it is a challenging fiscal situation that's faced. So that sets the context for it, and the narrative is constrained by that. But secondly, this point about actually what's the long-term plan for fiscal sustainability. Now, whether you can do that in the heat of election campaign, that's not my area of expertise, but particularly when the new Parliament comes in and the new government comes in, that the reality will hit about what is available in terms of the fiscal envelope, and that's where the rubber will really hit the road.
I mean, I think parties obviously err on the side of optimism because frankly, voters don't want to hear that things aren't really going to get that much better for the next 5 years, which is effective what you're saying. So there's a real issue there of trust and delivery, and can everyone say what they need to say sometimes? Now, one of the things that shocked me actually about this, and we've discussed this before to an extent, but I think it's very stark in the figures you've put down here. When we look at social security, what you've said here is in 3.19 is, and I quote, the number of people on ADP has increased, adult disability payment has increased from 320,000 in 2021-22 to 475,000 in 24-25. The percentage of working-age adults in Scotland reporting a disability rose from 19% in 2021 to 28% in 23-24, and is still rising. And you go on to say that you anticipate in 3.22 that the total number of people receiving disability payments in Scotland will exceed 1 million by 2030-31. Now, I know that when people are on adult disability, it's not means tested, so people who are working can also be on it. It's often for life, although people can be reviewed every 2 to 5 years. I'm just wondering why is there so many people on this? I mean, are there really so many people suffering from disability in our society?
Mm-hmm. So if you actually look at the the numbers of people who report having a disability, the number of people receiving these disability payments is lower than the people who are reporting it. That suggests that there are large numbers of people who are still having a disability but are not in receipt of those payments. So part of where the trend that we might be seeing is actually more awareness of the potential opportunity to access payments, the differences in systems that are now leading to higher inflows, not just in Scotland but across the UK into these payments. But we are seeing trends, and we've spoken about this before, which is that there is now rising trends of people who are now essentially saying that they have a disability, particularly around mental health and well-being. And that's particularly worrying amongst young people, and it's another area we've spoken about as well, about things like child disability payments. And again, that's not just unique to Scotland. There's lots of work done looking at the decline in mental well-being across across countries. It used to be the case there was a U-shape in well-being, that essentially you would have high levels of well-being when you were young and high levels of well-being when you were old, and you had relatively high incomes, and you had lower levels of well-being when you were working and you were in middle age. And actually that kind of U-shape disappeared, and you have relatively low levels of well-being at a relatively young age. And I think one of the really interesting policy questions is what's the long-term effects of that? So you're seeing quite significant inflows of young people into disability payments and reporting disabilities, particularly around mental health and well-being. What is the long-term effects of that on society, on public services and the economy? And what we can see with the data is the inflows coming in. The obvious question is, well, what's driving that, and what can you do upstream to potentially improve policy or to take action that means that you're not going to have that considerable inflow that you see from the data over the last few years. But
there seems to be, the rise seems to be inexorable, and I mean, are we really in such a short period of time becoming a sicker society? Is it? I mean, one could argue that there was a significant increase during COVID. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, but COVID is now some years in the past, and we realise that it had an impact on the younger generation. Of course we do, but it's not just younger people, is it? I mean, it wouldn't be 28%, of those of working age if it was just young people,
No, I think there's two parts. So one is there's a chart in our report where we look at the uplift in...
It's in all age groups, isn't it?
Yeah, across all age groups. And there's two parts to that. One, though, if you look at the biggest uplift, it's amongst young people. So that's where the bit that is concerning. There is a risk around, as our population ages, is that the proportion of people who are on disability payments rises with age, as you'd expect, as we get older. But that then means there's then a fiscal cost in there as our population ages. So even if you maintain those same levels of disability prevalence, but the population ages, that's going to cost more money into the public finances. And because our population is ageing more rapidly than the UK overall, there'll be a net fiscal challenge in there, because the flows coming in will not match that, because England and Wales don't have the same profile of the population.
And I mean, that's an issue, because you say in 337 that the funding the Scottish Government receives from the UK Government because of its spending on climate change mitigation, somewhat different from Social Security, but a different area, would not be sufficient to cover total costs faced by the Scottish Government. So we're in a situation whereby we're going to end up with a potential fiscal gap growing. Do you see it?
Well, this is the thing, where this is where the nature of the fiscal framework doesn't always link through to where some of the pressures would be. So obviously the largest part of the budget remains Barnett, which is a population share of equivalent spending in England or England and Wales, depending on the element to it. So if you have more investment needed in something like climate change in Scotland, then a Barnett consequential of similar investment in England or England and Wales will not match the additional spending that would be needed in a Scottish context. Of course, I was down in London yesterday chatting, and a number of people kept on pointing out, of course, that Barnett gives Scotland a higher percentage spend in the first instance, but it just means that any growth from this point is only going to be a per capita share, and some areas are going to be higher then a per capita is going to need to be.
But when you did one of your SPICE presentations on the impact of climate change long term, you said that the UK cannot reach its climate goals unless Scotland reaches it because of the disproportionate amount of work that has to be done, for example, on peatland restoration, for example. So is that not a factor that's been taken into consideration?
So you're right. And what we've said is that it's not just the fact that the UK overall needs Scotland to meet its climate goals. The UK all needs Scotland to meet its climate goals earlier. So the target in Scotland is important for the UK to meet through. I think that the climate change, and we've talked about this when we did our climate change work. I mean, for me, that's probably the one where you see the real interconnectedness between the fiscal framework for Scotland and a shared policy endeavour, where you've got policy responsibilities that are some are reserved, some are devolved. So for Scotland to meet its net zero target, it needs decisions taken by the UK government on energy, on the grid, on transport. So it needs decisions. Scotland needs decisions by the UK government to feed through. But also then on the spending side of things, how much and when the UK government spend on net zero mitigation, net zero and climate change mitigation will have an impact on how much money the Scottish government has got. But equally, you're right, what the Scottish government does will have an impact on whether the UK is going to meet there. And it's a classic area where that coordination and interconnectedness rubs up against the fiscal framework. And that, again, might be something into the future where there are these kind of genuinely shared policy priorities where you need the two governments to be working in lockstep in order to meet the targets that are going to be set out. Whatever you think about the constitutional settlement, whatever you think about the policies of it, it's just a simple mechanistic fact that you need certain decisions to be taken at certain points in time by different tiers of government, including local government, in order for these collective targets to be met.
Okay, thank you for that. Just two more questions from me. 3.41, you've said that spending on the Scottish Child Payment will be £522 million by 2030-31, which is an increase. Now, that's despite the birth rate being at a record low level. One would have expected that to fall unless you think that poverty is going to rise. Why is that sum going up?
Yeah, I mean, I think a large part of that, Claire will check, it will be inflation, the effects of inflation coming through.
Oh, so it's not real terms then?
Yeah, so that will be largely our assumption about the fact it will be rising inflation rather than falling.
Sorry, I just assumed that was a real terms figure.
Yeah, it's a nominal figure, yeah.
Okay, that's fine. Yep. Apologies for that then. Okay, and lastly, in terms of 3.28, local government services, the Improvement Service reported that in 22, 23, 23, 24, so that's obviously a couple of years back, the most recent data available, more performance indicators declined than improved, 45% declined compared to 39%. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us what reasons you feel there are for that, and if that's balanced. So, for example, the 45% that declined were the large areas of local government spending, or smaller areas, or were they equally balanced? Because some indicators might be quite small and others might be very significant. So I just wonder if you can tell us a wee bit more about the picture there.
Yeah, I don't know, Claire, if you want to maybe come in on some of the specifics. I think the general point that we make there is essentially, I guess, twofold. One is that for the legacy for the next Parliament, we're going to come in and face and inherit pressures, particularly in things like local government and health services. Local government's particularly interesting because we know that if you look at that, one of the areas that have been under pressure in the current parliamentary term in terms of budget allocations. And if you look at the spending review, again, because of the tight settlement and the prioritisation in health and social security, it means that the local government budget is going to be under significant pressure again. So that's one of the big factors that is driving that, is simple cash and funding. But Claire, I don't know if you want to come in on some of the specifics.
So these are based on reports by the Accounts Commission and the Auditor General, and so we're highlighting their conclusions that these are important findings and that public services are under pressure and that performance is in more areas declining rather than improving.
Because what governments do, wherever they are, they always try to talk about reducing spending or keeping spending the same or increasing it by less than perhaps might be required, because there are been real terms increases, I think, if we look at the big picture. But efficiencies don't always follow. You know, just because you're spending less money in an area doesn't mean it becomes more efficient.
No, and I think this is where, I think one of the really interesting things to pick up will be is that the government have set out quite ambitious efficiency saving target. So the spending review is underpinned by £1.5 billion of efficiency savings. They started to set out in broad terms what that would look like in terms of individual portfolios, but there's been no detail about, well, what are these and how will they be monitored over time to know you have made £1 billion worth of efficiency savings in health. What has that actually been in, and what have been the consequences of that? And that will be something which, at the start of the next parliamentary term, will be something that I think will have to be picked up to look at, because you're right, you can say we're going to save money, we're going to do efficiency savings to get the budget to balance and to allocate all the elements there. And then if you just move on to the next budget and say, well, this is what we're spending, we're going to make some savings there, there's no read-through into how you've actually spent the money, stopped spending the money, and what the outcome of that has been.
Yeah, always back to outcomes. Okay, well, thank you for that. First person to ask questions will be Michelle, to be followed by Liz.
Good morning, and thank you very much for your kind comments. I'd just like to confirm I'm not retiring. I'm going to do just sending a signal to the marketplace. And in return, thank you very much for all your efforts as well, which I've seen just some great stuff emerging over this parliamentary term. I just wanted to take it up a level. I mean, obviously, we're focusing on your document at the moment, but so much of our conversation now has to take place in the face of the considerable uncertainty introduced by global events over the past few days. I mean, we can be pretty uncertain that it's going to flow through into the economy in terms of inflation. There'll be a short-term impact of supply chains as well, for example, but also a longer-term potential impact around increased defence spending. I'd appreciate your kind of thoughts as to, you know, how you think it could impact things, because we do have some models to draw on, obviously the Russian-Ukraine thing. And I'd also want to explore, have you started modelling potential scenarios? Or you might not have done, but I'd appreciate your thoughts. Anyway.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and in some ways we always keep hoping, it's a bit like the productivity assumption, that that we're hoping the next few years will be more stable globally, and that will be one of the key reasons it can help economic growth come back, because it's not just the fact that these shocks have an impact on growth, but they dissuade investment and they lead to uncertainty, which acts as a brake on growth over the medium to long term. So for the Scottish budget, there's probably 2 or 3 key ways that this will flow through. So first of all, you're right, if this leads to a global economic slowdown, then Scotland won't be immune to that, and that will then feed through to the Scottish economy. It will feed through to trade. There's always a slight quirk in Scotland and the outlook for the Scottish economy, because anything that has an impact on energy can sometimes get a slight disconnect in the outlook for the Scottish economy. And we saw that a bit in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, where you saw the prices of energy going up, and that has an impact particularly in the northeast. So, but overall, there'll be an impact on economic growth. Then there's effects about what does that mean in individual sectors, on trade, on tourism, and the like. And I mentioned a broader point about the drag on investment and the uncertainty that provides. That's on the growth side. Then on the inflation side, you would expect, again, that anything that leads to higher energy prices will just flow right the way through into inflation. Inflation already is still above trend, so it's still sticky. So that, in turn, might lead to more aggressive action from the Bank of England to try and pull down inflation, which in turn might lead to effects on interest rates. So all those effects will come through on the economy, which in turn will then have an impact on the UK fiscal position. So even before you think about reprioritisation of spending, if all of this taken together means that the fiscal rules, the fiscal targets, are just going to do that little bit harder to meet. Not so much on the spending side or the revenue side, it's the fact that your economy is not going to grow as much as you might have thought it would have been, which gives you less fiscal headroom to work through. And then you're right, then it feeds through into then what might happen on the particular future plans around spending and whether that might lead to shifts in money again. Already, one of the reasons why we see the block grant growing so slowly relative to the overall growth in public spending is because the government is prioritising defence and security spending relative to other areas, which then means there's less money flowing through to education and things like that, which in turn leads to the kind of effects on Barnet. So overall, it's, you know, obviously it's still very early days, and need to wait and see what happens. But these are the sort of things which then would act as a kind of a headwind for the outlook for the Scottish budget and the economy. In terms of what we'll do about it, we will obviously just kind of monitor things. Obviously, there will be our report out today, which was probably, well, won't have much in it because it will have been written before the weekend. The Chancellor will probably provide an update on the Treasury's assessment about how it will feed through. So that will be the first signal of any kind of UK-wide macro effects at the margin. But it'll probably be a few months. It's the sort of thing we'll work on over the summer to see what the effects will be before we publish our updates later in the summer.
But either way, they're not going to be good and are going to add to an already constrained situation in a number of different areas.
Yeah, it's interesting because if you look at that living standards piece that we showed all the way up to the financial crisis, if you think about then that period since then, so you had the financial crisis, you had the uncertainty around Brexit, you had COVID, you had the Russia war in Ukraine, you had the energy price collapse, now you've got this. It's just a constant series of shocks which have an impact on your ability to A, manage the public finances, and B, to grow the economy.
And do you think there's a risk for a multitude of forecasting agencies, not just yourself, this kind of wish that things would turn a corner, that we're going to go back to something, a certainty that in reality is just not going to arise? And, you know, is that something you're aware of in your own organisation? I mean, as you've said, we've heard it non-stop with productivity post-2008, but the idea that we're going to return to a world that arguably no longer exists.
I was studying at uni when we were in the nice decade and everything was, we'd cracked macroeconomics and everything was stable.
An end to boom and bust, I seem
end
to
to boom and
remember.
bust, yeah, there's all those good phrases. And you're right, what we've seen now is this general weakness in productivity plus the succession of shocks that are feeding through to the economy. I mean, the challenge for us, and this is something, I guess, for us to think about, and we've tried to do a bit more around this, but it is a challenge in that, so we have to forecast a point estimate for the economy and for revenues, and because that's what we're there to do, because that underpins the budget. But you're right, I mean, you know, as of today, do you know exactly what the economic forecast or the economy will do next year, given everything that's going on? It's highly, highly uncertain. So there's a challenge for us about how we communicate that uncertainty, how we present it in a way which doesn't just say, well, it could be anything, but actually gives people reason that actually, you know, it is not guaranteed that it will be 1% or 1.5%. There's a lot of potential movement around that.
Yeah, and I suppose the last thing that it was good that the convener brought out the point about climate change, but the other one is technology. I mean, there's a lot of reports emerging now with amazing kind of projections around AI and what it will ultimately do to the labour market and how that will flow into the wider economy. And I appreciate, and I think I've probably asked you about this before, it's impossible to forecast with any degree of accuracy. However, there will be a tipping point where, without giving that consideration, we're all living in a bubble, an utterly meaningless bubble, because there's no certainty whatsoever. How are you thinking about how you start to manage that?
Yeah. So some of it, I think, is put it into context, and I think so. Some of the stuff in AI, and this is just a personal view about it, some of it I think is over-egged a bit about how much is going to radically change everything, at least in the short to medium term. So it might have an impact in there, and we did highlight in January that the OBR have done some work about saying that they think that AI might boost productivity toward the end of the forecast period. And we did something similar around our commentary that could be there. I think the key thing, it comes back to the point I said about to convener, the key thing is about whether the improvements we're seeing in tech and digital at a macro level are labour enhancing or labour replacing, and that's the key effect in terms of the overall macro element. And then within that, there's a really big distributional question, because if it's labour replacing, who gets the benefit from that? It's not the workers that are being replaced, it's the people who own the capital that is doing the replacing. And how do you ensure that that is distributed fairly over the long term? Will probably be the big policy question, not just for Scotland, but at a macro level globally too.
Yeah. Anyway, back to the matter at hand. We've talked about this, and it's usually Liz Smith that brings it up. In terms of the behavioural impact of fiscal drag, I mean, obviously I know you routinely factor and make an assessment of that. But given the quite stark differential now between Scotland and the rest of the UK in terms of the amount of people that are being pulled into the high rate tax band, have you given that further thought? Is that becoming an increasing concern? How are you treating that?
Yeah, so it's something we monitor all the time, and John might want to come in about how we do that. So we always look at tax elasticities, check to make sure that they're still based upon the right evidence there. I think the interesting thing, again, it's where this is really important is about who are the type of people that are going to be paying these higher rates of tax, and how much flexibility have they got to change their behaviour. So that we tend to assume a much higher elasticity response at the top end of the income distribution, because that tends to be people who have greater flexibility to adjust their tax affairs, whether that be to self-incorporate, to relocate, to work less hours, those sorts of things. With the fiscal drag and the freezing of the higher rate threshold, the vast majority of people in there will be people on salaried jobs who will have much less flexibility to take action in the short run to do anything. It's the sort of thing, again, in time, as you'll see, it might be the sort of thing you might see start to remove some things like part-time working, flexible working, early retirement. Those are the sorts of effects you might start to see at the margin. But for the most part, it's probably not likely to see radical, huge changes in behaviour because of the nature of the labour force, so the people who are going into these higher tax bands.
And that leads me on to my last question. And you mentioned at the start about me pushing on diversity. I did one of my routine kind of search and keyword in your report, and I notice that there's women are mentioned once, disability is mentioned 28 times, child is mentioned 40, and it was a bit hard to search on ageing because you use different terms. But I suppose I mean, given that with the challenges we've got, particularly around cuts to health and social care, we know that will have a disproportionate impact on women given their role in caring and the number of women in these sort of professions, poverty effects and more. I just wondered, I mean, we're blind to the data on this in your report, and I think it's something I've pointed out before. What's your rationale behind that? Because I'd like to understand that, and might that be something that you consider at some future point? Because I think there's a disproportionate impact when we look at certain scenarios which are emerging. And I don't think that your report gives us that data or that insight. I'm sure you have it.
I mean, it's a fair challenge. I mean, part of it, I think, is that because we're looking at the macro effects, so when we're looking at things like child or disability, that's because it's a particular thing within the public finances that we're picking up. But you're right. I mean, I think there's more that can be done to look at, well, what's the inclusive effects in here? So if the effects around growth, impacts on things like local government budgets being cut, are they got a disproportionate impact in there? I mean, it's the sort of thing that we've highlighted. We might start to look at if there's demand for it in things like our long-term fiscal sustainability work, where you could feed that through and start to look at that. Part of that comes back to data and the quality of data, and we've spoken about some of the real challenges with the labour market data. So the obvious thing that I would go to look at to look at differences in gender, for example, would be to go right in and look at the labour market data, but we've know there's real big challenges in that recently. Hopefully that starts to turn around, which then means we can start to look more, much better at different rates about effects on the economy, what sectors are most likely to be exposed to economic shocks, etc. And that would probably be something we would pick up in our fiscal sustainability report.
And you could also help me in my eventually failed mission to get the Scottish Government to routinely disaggregate and collect data by sex. They do in many areas, but not in others. Anyway, that's me. Thanks, Convener.
Very much. Liz will be followed by John.
Good morning.
I'm Michelle Thompson, and thank you for your kind remarks. But can I also put on the record just my gratitude for all that you, Professor Roy, and your colleagues have done for this committee. I think it's been something that's extremely important to the Parliament, so thank you very much for that. I'm not sure that the data that you have presented to us is enough for all of us to retire, but thank you very much for all your work. Can I concentrate on this section in your report about the in-tray for the Scottish Government? And the convener quite rightly pointed out in the first bit, 3.1, I think it was, that political parties need to be clear about what the Scottish Government can afford. I think that's absolutely true. I think all political parties should, they don't always do it, but they should make sure that when they are presenting their own policies, manifestos, that they are properly costed, etc. But there's something else that I think is important here, and I think it's a message for the next Parliament, that when it comes to government stating their overall objectives, and we have 4 for this government, we've got tackling child poverty, we've got ensuring there's economic growth, we've got sustainable public services, and we've got addressing climate change. Now, these are all ambitions and aims, but they are not the specific policies which underpin what we're trying to do. And I just wondered, when it comes to any government setting its priorities, do we have enough data that tells us which policies are providing the outcomes, the best outcomes when it comes to delivery? And do we have enough data on which policies have been deprioritised because they don't provide that delivery in the same way?
Yeah. I mean, so the short answer is we don't have that. That's not published in a routine way or collected in a way which the government does that. But all that is really for government to do around how they're evaluating policies, how they're tracking it. We saw, obviously, the climate change probably is a good example of that, where we said, this is what you need to set out. You need to be able to trace through the policies and the effects of the policies on reduction in emissions. You need to then get that to speak to the budget, so you can open up the budget document and you can see exactly where the money is going to then flow through to the policies, which then flow to what's happening to emissions, and that doesn't exist.
So would it be your advice, I know you can't comment on what policies they should choose, but would it be your advice to the next Parliament that greater care is taken to set out what these priority policies are in terms of the budget, and to provide the evidence that underpins them, that they are better at delivering the outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, anything that improves transparency or anything that helps scrutiny, would be welcome. So if you've got big ticket items, what are the collective policies that you're taking? How much are they costing? When they're being delivered? And then what's the effect? And you can do that. I mean, you can do an appraisal of what you think the effects will be, and then you can monitor to track whether these effects are as you thought they would be, and then you can evaluate whether or not they've had the effect there. And that is entirely possible for...
I'm asking the question on the back of the comment that political parties need to be clear about what government can afford. And part of that decision depends on which policies we feel are making the greatest impact on what we're trying to achieve. And I've personally found over my 20 years in this place that's quite difficult to track. And that makes it difficult for MSPs, but particularly for Scottish Government and for this committee, to be able to drill down sufficiently on where we really are getting the best bang for the buck. in terms of public spending. And given what all the challenges are that you've quite rightly set out in your report, it's absolutely vital that we try to do a bit more on this, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I think there's two parts. So one is, obviously, I understand that, you know, Parliament's resources are limited in this space, and MSP's resources are limited to do that dive in there. Government has got the resources to do it if they wanted to do it and wish to do it. And that might be, again, gives you the chance to, or the future committee to give the chance to really scrutinise and say, well, this is your priority. Back to what we said about climate change being an example of that. What are you spending? When are you spending it? How is it being tracked? What are you not doing? What are you evaluating? And to be really quite open about how that works. The MTFS is obviously a place that could do that. We've mentioned that we think we could have a bit more of a role in the MTFS to track spending and to be do a bit more scrutiny on what the government are doing within spending in there. That will always necessarily be relatively macro, whereas what you're really talking about is, well, how do you get into the weeds to really work out, you know, if you're wanting to tackle child poverty and you've got an extra £100 million to spend, is it best to be spent on uplifting the Scottish Child Payment, or is it better to be spent in breakfast clubs or giving money to local government? Or
exactly,
that's the bit which is.
That's exactly my point. I think that's where we need to find more detail on that to ensure that we are spending money in the best possible way. I think my other reflection would be that there are several seriously big challenges facing the next Parliament, and one of them is about the decision over universal payments. There's a lot of commentary just now about which universal payments, in the context of what do they deliver and how well do they deliver that. Do you think that in a post-election period, as opposed to the pre-election period, it will be easier to have cross-party and additional evidence from outside to help our understanding of the universal issue? Because there is an argument that we can't possibly afford all universal payments as they are just now without very considerable implications for the rest of the budget.
Mm-hmm. I mean, ultimately that will be a policy decision about what's the relative focus, and we wouldn't comment on whether or not it's the right thing to do or not. A couple of general points about that, I would say, though, is that obviously universal payments cover a lot of things that have quite significant different numbers from attached to it. So I think there's a bit about working through what do we mean and what are the potential implications of that. Comes back to your first question about evidence. So what is the evidence that this payment that is universal is having the desired effects, or is it potentially skewing effects? How much does it cost? What would be saving? What's the opportunity cost of potentially spending that money somewhere else? I think you're right. I think that obviously the next 5 years, based on our numbers, suggest everything is looking really challenging. So you then, in many ways, start to have to move into conversations about, well, actually, if you just look from an arithmetic point of view, continuing as you're going at the moment is going to be really, really challenging, and without taking different action, things are going to become more tricky. So do you start to think about, well, where actually could you do something different, or how much of this is a priority relative to where you could spend this money somewhere else?
Okay, that's very helpful. My last point is about the fiscal framework, which is technically in the next government's in-tray as well. And again, without mentioning what the policy should be behind that, are there any aspects of the structure of the fiscal framework that you would like the Scottish Government and UK governments to address?
I might bring John and Claire want to come in as well. I mean, just to really quickly, I think there is the broad challenge about how does the government balance its budget every year, and does it have the levers that it needs to, purely from a cash flow and a monitoring and a budgeting position? Are they as flexible enough? And what we've seen in recent years is the Scottish Government increasingly using things like ScotWind as a balancing mechanism, as to say, well, actually, we don't have enough in the reserve, we can't put enough in the reserve, we can't borrow enough, we don't have the ability to have an overdraft. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that we're going to use Scotland, and that is a balancing item in there, and that just doesn't feel right. So there's a question about how much flexibilities they've got to manage the budget there. The one thing which I know is always going to be really tricky is just the timing of fiscal events. The more certainty you can get around fiscal events, the more time that you can get between a UK fiscal event and a Scottish fiscal event, which still gives the Parliament time to scrutinise. They would seem to be, for me, the two obvious, but I don't know whether Claire and John have got a wish list as well.
I think a lot of things in the fiscal framework, we can explain what the effect is of the way that they work, but ultimately it'll be a political negotiation, and there's political trade-offs from both sides that would determine how. So it feels like it's probably, for other things, other than the ones that Graham's already talked about, it's probably a little bit hard for us to make recommendations for how they would work. But I think the interlinkages between the Scottish budget and the UK budget, because of fiscal devolution, mean that the timing point is probably one of the most important ones.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. John. Patrick?
Well, seeing you said I was being healthily sceptical, I shall continue on that route. But, yeah, I mean, just to say, you know, we've looked at commissions, we've looked at all sorts of things in this Parliament, and, you know, and the point's been made often that we need public inquiries because there's a lack of trust in the public sector and all these things. But, I mean, I think the confidence in yourselves, and along with others like the Auditor General, is exceptional, and that's very commendable, and all of you have to be thanked for creating that position. I think we want that to continue. So, back to healthy scepticism. You've got quite a section in your report about the impact of UK government fiscal decisions, and I'm interested in that whole space. We've touched on it before, that we can plan all we like, and we can think we've got a certain amount of a deficit or budget gap or whatever it is, and then suddenly the winter fuel payment changes, or the two-child limit mitigation changes, or there's welfare reforms or whatever.
Yeah.
How do we get the balance right in that, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the first few years of the big tax and social security devolution was all about the Scottish Government doing different things, and a lot of stuff we were chatting about was about, well, this is what the Scottish Government have chosen to do, this is the cost of it, this is how it's increased. But we've seen, particularly the last year to 18 months, the fact that this is an independent process, and UK Government decisions have a big impact on the Scottish budget. It's come particularly through social security, but it could have come through on tax. So remember, back in October, there was a talk about potential income tax changes at the UK level. That would have had an immediate and quite significant impact upon the Scottish budget. So I think that there's, this is the nature of the framework. That's the nature of the framework, is that if the UK government take decisions in areas that are devolved, that will have immediate consequences for the Scottish budget. I mean, it comes back to the point about the fiscal framework. What do you do around that? Is there ways that you can potentially find ways to have, you know, greater planning or more certainty? Obviously, only having one fiscal event potentially helps in that regard, so you can see the potential effects coming through. But you know, the £1 billion swing that we saw from our forecast in June to our forecast in January, largely because of changes in UK government policy, or potential changes in UK government policy, is something which is the government have to balance it and to deal with. The point of principle is that Scotland shouldn't be impacted, benefit, or negatively affected by decisions that are going to have an impact on England and Wales. So that's the framework working. I think from a public finance point of view and a management point of view, it's the timing effect and the ability for these to move around, which is a particular challenge.
I mean, what would the answer to? I mean, in a kind of ideal world, I'm thinking, well, then we should ask the UK government, as part of the fiscal framework, that they would always give us a year's notice or something like that before they made any change, and then we could plan accordingly. But I mean, even today, they could make us. I don't think that. They've hinted they're not going to say anything very dramatic, but if they did. Then that would immediately impact us again, wouldn't it?
So I don't know if Claire wants to come in, but yeah, the timing is the key bit. So how much? So that, as I said, the fact that if the UK government make a reform on personal independent payments to reduce payments equivalent payments for people in England and Wales, then it is entirely right under this framework that Scotland shouldn't benefit from that. If you see what I mean, if there's savings to be made, then Scotland shouldn't have the same funding flowing through. That savings should be made in Scotland, and it's then up to the Scottish Government to either decide to mitigate that or not. So that's a framework working as it should. The question then becomes about, well, how much time has the Scottish Government got to plan for that? And that's where, again, it comes back to the point of, can you within the framework potentially have greater ways where you can flex monies over within years? So the government can only borrow for differences in forecasts within social security within coming through within a year. The block grant adjustments change, but what they can't do is structurally borrow to say, well, you told us this in December, we weren't planning for this. Would give us a year of grace period. There is no mechanism that they could essentially borrow for that, and then say, well, we'll pay it back, but we just want a year to plan to get ready for it.
Well, sometimes they have given us a bit of extra flexibility, is that right, when they've made a last-minute change?
Yeah, I mean, there's some things that would happen through Barnett, for example, which had in COVID, for example, when they did things around certainties of payments and things like that. So there has been changes to different elements of flexibility. And there's also stuff within the fiscal framework about when they make an announcement, then you can delay that coming through. But I guess your broader point is that, well, okay, this might be outside that timing and framework period where you've got that grace period, but it's such a big significant change relative to what they had planned, then the Scottish Government would have to adjust accordingly.
Did you want to come in, Ms. Murray?
I was just going to say, this is a bit of a sort of strange thing, I guess, in terms of timing. So, like, if the UK Government makes an announcement in the autumn and then we have our Scottish budget, that has to be factored in when the budget's set for the next year. But if the UK Government makes a change today for next year, then there's provision in the fiscal framework that the government doesn't take the hit initially, it comes through a bit later. But actually the reality of those timing differences in terms of the government having to manage it is pretty negligible. So there's sort of like very small technicalities about whether, we have some adjustments for outturn data from DWP came in a bit late, so the government has deferred that final reconciliation until the next year. But that came through, in the autumn. But then we could still have some big changes coming through during the current financial year on social security or the fully devolved taxes that the government have to manage in year. Yeah. So it feels there's a bit of sort of imbalance about when the government can access borrowing and when it can't.
And is that kind of almost inevitable, or could we pin something down in a revised fiscal framework that would tidy it up a bit?
I think the suggestion is Graham.
So the one way you could do it from a technical point of view would be to allow the government to potentially borrow on the revenue side, not for a forecast error,
yes,
but for a major change in policy, or actually just to have some revenue borrowing that they could do year to year to manage that. That's the one technical way you could do it.
There's potentially also something about a spending review if the UK government stuck to its system of having more regular spending reviews, because one of the things is we had the UK spending review and we had the MTFS, and then since then there've been changes. So if you think if the government was planning over 3 years, which it should be doing, you can see that those uncertainties and those changes over a 3-year period will have an effect on planning and the budget. But the government can only borrow or can only make those adjustments for the coming year's budget under the fiscal framework.
Okay. Thank you. I mean, the 1.5 billion savings got mentioned earlier on, I think, by the convener. I mean, I was interested in it's page 13, 1.45. It says the spending review indicates the Scottish Government has identified 1.5 billion of savings. But is that just in a very kind of general sense? It's not identified very specific?
We don't know. I mean, you would hope they have identified it. But if you remember, within the spending review, they also published these, I can't remember the name of the document, portfolio efficiency plans or something like that, they called it, and they basically had broken down the 1.5 billion by how much savings they expect to be made within each portfolio. There's 2 ways that could be taken. That could just be a macro imposition of this is how much you're to save, or it could be a bottom-up, this is what we think you could save, and we've counted this up and it's come up to 1.5 billion. So it could be one or the other.
Okay, thank you. the whole thing about the population ageing, I mean, I'm just kind of wondering how much I should worry about that. I'm obviously ageing and about to retire, so that's one angle. But more widely, because, I mean, we're looking at these 16 to 64 numbers, the percentage of the population and so on that are 16 to 64, which traditionally was the working age. But, I mean, already, and I guess we keep using them, is it so we get comparability between previous years? Is that the reason for it?
Yes, yeah.
Whereas everybody's practically working till 66 now,
Yeah.
I think it's gradually going up again. Is that right? 66 in 2 months or something like that. So, I mean, does that not kind of counteract that problem, or is there still a problem in there?
Yeah. So the main effect comes through on the spending side. So on the revenue side, you're right. There's the traditional working age is now changing, and that is going to have an impact. It might have a marginal impact on income tax revenues over time, of course, as people do age beyond 65 and do move into retirement. I think that the broader point and the bit where it really matters from a Scottish perspective is twofold. So one is it isn't so much the population age 65 and above, it's the population age 75 and above, which particularly increases in Scotland over the next decade and a half. And the variation within that that's really important is Scotland's share of that population within the UK. So it's not just the fact that Scotland's population is ageing, it's ageing in the UK, but it's ageing more quickly in Scotland than it is in the UK. And if you get a Barnett population of spending in health, then it's not an age population share of health, it's just a population share. And that's the bit where you think over the next 10 to 15 years, there's a particular pinch point within the age demographics in Scotland relative to England and Wales. Of course, they'll catch up with us, and their population will age and catch up in the future. Yeah. But there's just this particular wedge coming through over the next 10 to 15 years where Scotland's population will age and the share of the UK population will increase.
So, I mean, the fiscal framework is complicated enough as it is, if we were to kind of try and build that in. But, I mean, potentially it's something that presumably the governments could discuss as to whether they should tweak the fiscal framework.
Yeah, I mean, in principle, you could do Barnett. You could do Barnett's with variation. You could do all manner of things. You could do lots of things with technical and stuff in there. I should say, given now again, I was in London yesterday, and it was pointed out to me repeatedly, is that the Barnett baseline is higher in Scotland per head relative to England and Wales. So you open up a broader conversation about how you do needs assessment across the UK. Did
you want to come in, Mr. Ireland? Were you going? No, sorry, I thought you were indicating. Yeah, okay, fair enough. And another point the convener talked on was, let me just find it, page 31, where we talk about performance of several key public services has been falling. I mean, just taking health, for example, I mean, there's long waiting lists, etc., but is that necessarily because the health service is failing, or is it because people's demands and expectations are increasing? And I mean, there seem to be more. I mean, it's good that there's much more discussion around mental health than there used to be. So maybe that's not an increased need, but it's certainly an increased realisation of need, perhaps. Yeah. And something like obesity, which I think wasn't around so much when I was starting my working life, seems to have increased a bit as well. So can we differentiate between, there's a kind of increasing demand on the one hand, or increasing need, and actually whether the service is failing?
So there's a couple of, these reports go into some detail around different aspects of that. Some of it is increased demand post-COVID and the effects of ill health feeding through. Some of it is the ageing population. So again, the health, the average age of the population looks, quite different from what it was, 20 years ago. So that is affected, putting more pressures in there. But we've spoken about it before. Conveners raised this, things like productivity measures within the NHS have been under pressure and declining and challenging in recent times. And then there's just been, all the kind of challenges in terms of delivery, in terms of things like delayed discharges, all those sorts of things, which have all kind of, when you package it together, means that's why the outcomes have been under pressure, and the NHS has faced a challenging situation. Add on top of that things like health inflation rising faster than the GDP inflator that is used, then feeds through to we actually getting more money, but the ability of that money to be spent on stuff is under pressure because drugs are more expensive, treatments are more expensive, and that all adds up to that pressure that's faced.
So do you have to, is it inevitable, is the health service different from other parts that you have to kind of in a sense put more money in almost just to stand still, and especially if we've got an ageing population and all these other factors that you've mentioned?
Yes, yes. So in a country where the population is ageing, then to maintain this, even just to maintain the same standard, you're going to have to put more money into that, because we've done some charts which show that the average cost, the average demand on the health service increases, particularly as you get above 75. Then if you have more people over 75, just to stay still, you need to put more money into that. Yes. Add on top of that things like new treatments, new drugs, demand, prevalence coming into that, then that all makes it more challenging. Of course, the real solution to all of this, and it's easy to say, but the real solution to all of this is not to stop us ageing, because that's that's a good thing. But it's how do we age healthily? And that's the key thing that needs to happen. And that's not just health spending, that's spending across all aspects of the public sector.
And this thing about productivity, I mean, is it just inevitable that the health service will always be more people intensive? I mean, I've got an issue with my eye and I go in for a test, so I see somebody to do my distance, somebody else does the pressure, somebody else gives me an injection, these kind of things. It's quite hard to see how they could cut down the number of people that are involved in that.
Yeah, so it's labour intensive. So we've talked about some of the effects of productivity. Claire might want to come in here as well. But we've talked about some of the effects of productivity in the health system and why it's different from elsewhere. You don't. So if you get a technological improvement in most other sectors and industries, a technological improvement leads to efficiencies and reduces costs and has an impact on demand. Historically, when you have a technological improvement in health, it actually leads to increased demand and increased cost. So if you have a new drug discovery, for example, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to save money. It actually might mean you're going to have more money, and that's the effects that happen over time. But Claire, do you want to come in on some of the stuff?
I mean, I think you've summarised it. We covered it quite extensively in our report last year on health, but there are, and these are assumptions that are made as well, because ultimately society and politicians could make choices about whether they continue to fund health in that way, but it's seen internationally that you tend to have increases in health spending that are above what might otherwise be implied just from the ageing population, but also you don't see quite the same improvements in labour productivity because it's more labour intensive.
So you're saying that's an international issue as well,
yes.
Not just here, right? Okay, that's great. Thanks, Convener.
Thank you. Patrick, to be followed by Michael.
Convener, good morning. I wanted to touch on two topics, local government and then climate. On local government, your report picks out the expectation that local government's in line for a pretty raw deal over the coming years compared with other areas of Scottish Government spending. That's in a context where we already hear about severe pressures and about some councils facing a genuine risk that they'll fail to meet statutory obligations. And quite a few of the witnesses who've spoken to us when we've been looking at our legacy issues have highlighted this as well in terms of the issues around the broken nature of the council tax is the phrase that comes out most frequently. The idea that we don't have a functional modern tax system for local government. We've spoken in the past about the fact that you don't make the projections for council tax because it's a local tax, but it seems to me that echoes in a way the fact that the Scottish Government really sort of has a bit of a kind of hands-off approach. It will set the financial context for local government, and then it's for local government to worry about the actual consequences. Can you comment on where we stand at the moment, what the likely impact of the kind of spending reductions that you've highlighted on those services is going to be, but also on how we grasp this challenge of developing a coherent approach to taxation generally, assuming there continues to be a majority in the next Parliament for progressive tax as a principle, an element of redistribution to fund universal services and so on. How can council tax or local government taxation more generally play its part in a coherent tax policy for Scotland when the current system is so wildly out of date?
Yeah. So, I mean, on the point about, if I pick up the point about tax, and I'll say a bit more about what we're thinking we can do in this space, and in part due to your question last time, but also, again, I think picking up on that kind of sense from what we're seeing from other people as well around local government. You're right. I mean, there's a technical reason, as you know, we don't forecast council tax, and because that's not within our remit within there. But if you look at the basket of taxes that within that devolved space, council tax is hugely hugely important in that. And you're right. I mean, you'll probably know the reasons why better than me. But I mean, it always struck me as that there is a broad consensus about wanting to reform council tax, but we're never able to do it, going way back to the first the first coalition government which did that, and it's obviously the one which is people is crying out from most people in terms of how you can reform it, how you can make it more effective, how can you raise revenue and do that. So I think that's more for politicians and policymakers to think in the next Parliament about what you do there. I think for us, what I think we can do much more of, and what we're looking into do and keen to do more on, is particularly around on the spending side of things within local government. So what we do at the moment is that we look at the overall outlook for the government, what they're going to essentially allocate to the local government budget, and then we see that that is going to pick up the slack. I think there's a lot more we can do to look into that. There's a lot more we can do to look at what other local government funding or what local governments are funding themselves to then spend on elements and trace that through to outcomes. So that's potentially one area we're thinking. That was part of the OECD review. It's been part of our ask to expand our work into spending. And I think that's probably one of the areas that we'll really focus upon over the next year, is what more we can say to help Parliament in that space around local government. Because you're right, it's something which we haven't really looked at, in part because it's not been in our remit, but I think it's sufficiently within our remit, particularly on the spending side, that we can look into that and say much more about it.
And would that look at the implications for local government services or for the rest of the public sector as well? For example, when local government can't do its work to the standard it would wish, that will have a knock-on impact on the health service. When the Scottish Government's trying to put an extra 100 million a year into culture, the danger is that simply results in local councils cutting their culture spending much more than they were already doing, because they know that extra money is coming in from national. Yeah,
I think there's two bits. There's a bit which I think is interesting, which is what's happening to the overall feed through of spending. But I think you're right into the really interesting bit is how do they interact in there. So how do we know in some of the big ticket areas where different spending priorities are going, and what's the interaction between it? So do we know, for example, from the data that's published by the Scottish Government about what local governments are saving, what budgets are declining in there, but then is what else is the Scottish Government spending that is maybe offsetting that? And that's the bit which I think is, we'd be interested to do. I mean, education is a really good example of that, where you've now got local government spending on education, but then Scottish Government spending monies and transferring revenues and tracing all that through will be quite a bit of work, but I think it'd be a really important, interesting piece to do.
Okay, thank you. On climate, you've spoken about this already a couple of times during the meeting. Most of that has been around the drive to net zero, about how to achieve that, about whether the fact that Scotland's behind schedule on that is going to put at risk UK targets and the cost of catching up on the lost ground and making progress toward the targets. But the flip side of it also, though, is the cost of inaction. I don't know if the Commission's had a chance yet to look at the National Security Assessment of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse. If memory serves, it was due to be published in August. A shortened, edited version of it was published by the UK government in January. And then just in the last week or so, I think at the end of February, media got hold of the full version and published that, showing that environmental damage can cost up to 12% of GDP by 2030. That's obviously within the term of the Parliament we're about to elect, and that's a much more significant economic cost than previously estimated. Is that something the Commission has looked at? Obviously, you're not an environmental advisor or regulator, but looking at the fiscal implications of the failure that we're already in relation to ecosystem collapse.
So, yeah, you're right. I mean, so what we've done so far is look at the mitigation. So what we do in transition, the drive towards net zero. And that's really important because it's saying, well, look, actually, if you're serious about this, then you're going to have to invest in this, and this is where you're going to have to invest, and this needs to be part of the planning, particularly around capital. But we've always been quite careful to highlight that there is also the adaptation piece, plus also the damage piece in there. And we always have started our climate report by saying the cost of inaction is significantly greater than the cost of action. And I can't remember the OBR had a number we used, which basically shows that if you project forward the damage costs, then essentially the public finances become unsustainable. So we start with that point and say, well, given that, we assume that you're going to do something. This is the cost. This is then what you need to do, and these are the investments that go in there. I think the next bit, when we come to do the climate work again, we'll start to look much more at the adaptation stuff. The reason we haven't done too much on that is that the government hadn't, by the time we did our work, really set out any of the detail behind that. But that's an area where I think is in our next set of fiscal sustainability reports in the next Parliament, will be one of the things that we'd want to have a look at and update the climate work to look at essentially the costs and the adaptation and the different scenarios about if you do nothing and trace that through. So, yeah, that'd be something we'll definitely look at.
In a way, it relates to a question that Michelle Thompson asked earlier about whether there's a range of factors suggesting that the old normal is gone and that we're not going to return to something that you described from your university days as the kind of assumptions that everybody worked with. The phrase limits to growth is older than I am now. The idea that breaching environmental thresholds will make growth unsustainable. Do we need to confront the question that has already happened now, that the ecosystem thresholds have been breached to the extent that growth is unsustainable?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a subjective judgment, and I know there's different opinions in that, but I think the general point that you're making, I think, is right about saying, well, actually, going back to like that nice decade when I was studying economics, it was just the only thing you mattered about was growth in the economy. Let it rip, and then you worry about, okay, there might be some damage, but you can find some ways of compensating for that. I think there's a much greater understanding that that's not sustainable. There's obviously different opinions about whether you still need growth or the quality of growth, and whether you can do things differently in there, or whether the focus should more be about, well, you've actually gone beyond your limits. It's about coming back on that. But bringing it back, I think, to our work, and where I think really useful for the next Parliament as well, is that, and this comes back a bit to Michelle Thompson's point about the stuff on diversity. So much of what we do is driven by what data is available and what the government are presenting us. So one reason we can do the work on net zero is that because we've got a plan. They've set out, this is our plan, and then we can go from there and we can work with them in the data and then present that. The reason we didn't do it in adaptation was because there wasn't a plan. There wasn't a plan for that. So there's something about how we can get the data to be driven into it. So what are the government doing and thinking about, well, what are the costs? What would be the cost if temperatures rise? What would be the effects on housing, on the environment, etc. And then we can then do our work and think about what the public finances are for that. But we're not, as you say, we're not environmental experts. We really need others to do that legwork and groundwork for us to do it. So in things like our statement of data needs, that's where we'll ask the government to do more, and then we can do our stuff.
Sorry, just a last question. Are you saying that you specifically need the Scottish Government to commission its own work on that, or is, for example, the national security assessment something that could be drawn on to understand the consequences for Scotland?
Yeah, so in principle, we'll use other people's, where we can, other people's reports. So, for example, we use the OBR, we use the climate change, we adopt their methodology. And what really matters for us is the Scottish-specific stuff. So again, I've not read the report, but if there's something specific on Scotland, then that's the sort of thing we can then use. Mm-hmm. But clearly, if the Scottish Government can do their own work, publish the data, share that transparently, that's a good thing because it helps improve the debate there. But then we can then come in and start to look at what the public finance implications would be. So what might be the hit to tax revenues, or what might be the additional investment that goes in.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Michael.
Thanks, Convener. Taking back to this year's budget, you are obviously concerned about the pay policy. You mentioned, I think, in the report that most NHS Scotland staff would be looking at a 0.78% pay rise. I mean, that you clearly don't feel that pay policy looks like it's sustainable. Is that the case?
Yeah. So you mean for next?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think broadly, I guess you see from the language there, we change it quite carefully in the sense that the government have set out their 9%. They're really close to that. We think, and the phrase we use, we think there's a risk that pay awards will exceed the limit, and that's why in our income tax forecast, in our earnings forecast, we didn't use those forecasts when we were projecting in it. We went back to our baseline, which is that pay awards will be at least inflation, and yeah, part of it will come down to what's in the other side of the ledger in terms of workforce and how the government will address that. Because clearly, if they take greater action on their workforce, then that can let them be more generous within their overall pay envelope they must have set out on wages.
And the external commentators, Institute for Fiscal Studies, Fraser Lander, who you know well, are very sceptical about these figures holding for the forthcoming year as well. Yeah. They're both predicting the very strong likelihood of an emergency budget, whoever forms the government. Is that? Do you think that's a likelihood as well?
In terms of coming back into pay, well, the government have said that they will revise their pay policy as part of the budget that they'll publish in the autumn. The question, I guess, is how quickly they do that. Obviously, unions will have a role within that in there. I guess the obvious thing that we say is that unless there is a changing in the funding envelope, if you're going to put more money into public sector pay, then where is this coming from? And how does your overall portfolio allocations you've set out in your spending review balance if you're going to have to put more money into pay, remembering that pay accounts for over half of the budget?
But for 26-27, we've got another budget where, in essence, we're hoping that something comes along to bail out the government before the end of the year. That's the distinct impression, isn't it?
Well, that's for you need to watch our year. So that's the 27-28 is where we're saying that the pay awards are going to have to come in. So 26-27, assumption will be is that's balanced and that comes through. So it's more about what will happen in 27-28, whether that policy will be achievable or not. The broader point I would say is that history has shown, and this might be different again, some of the things we've seen over the weekend about where government might have to divert funding to, history has shown that governments do come back through the spending review and add more money in, and that might be one of the planning assumptions for government, is that there might be more block grant Barnett consequentials coming down the line in 27-28. UK government might have a more generous pay award settlement coming down, which might help them out. But that's all to be seen about how the funding will flow at a later date.
I'll come back to those assumptions in a moment. I mean, I suppose this is just thinking about the kind of broader legacy issues, and we've talked quite a bit about Scotland and how that's drawn on at different times. I mean, it has proven, and you've already said today, quite useful to the Scottish Government essentially to have a second reserve.
Yeah.
The reality is that that's been created through a windfall moment, and that the political pressure is essentially that they are driving this budget to its limits every single year, hoping that something comes along in order to bail them out within the year. It doesn't lead to any ability for strategic planning. We heard that last week from the people who are contributing to it. I mean, it's not really a particularly sustainable model for how to run a budget, is it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably two things I'd say. So you're right on the broader point about Scotland. I think the fact that you, if what you're doing is using that as an additional fiscal flexibility in there, that comes back to the point about, well, actually, do you need greater fiscal flexibilities to manage it? Of course, if you're using it as a fiscal flexibility tool, you're not using it for the purpose that you should do, which is, or hoping to do, which is to invest in the transition to net zero and climate. Because if you're just using it as a bank, then that doesn't flow through as you would. On the point about, yeah, sorry.
I think it feels to me that it's slightly worse than that, though. That it's actually, if it was an existing fiscal flexibility, the government would drive to the extremity of that as well. It's the fact that it's not an existing fiscal flexibility that means they can use it, or they are using it as a real flexibility. So if you put that into an increased borrowing capability, the government would just max it out, wouldn't they? That's the character of what they do.
Yeah, but I guess the thing about, if you're using it as borrowing, obviously the thing is you have to pay it back. And again, you could think about designing a framework that was, if you're purely using it as ability so you don't overspend, then you could have it, you could set a framework up that let you project on that, but had quite a high penalty in terms of interest rate and in terms of quick repayment back. It wouldn't have to be like the capital budget, for example, where you've got time to do it. It could, if it's purely a mechanism to balance, you could set up quite a high interest rate, just like everybody. You have a different interest rate depending on whether you're overdrafting your overdraft on your current account versus whether you're investing on your mortgage. So you could do mechanisms in there. I think, and then the only thing I would say is you're right. I think that the government and the government is not surprising that they try and maximise the spend, again, because if you don't do that and you have an underspend, what are you going to do with that underspend, particularly with the pressures that you see within the budget? So in many ways, going right to the limit is actually a strategy in its own right about how you manage the public finances, because you don't have that flexibility that you would to think over, to save money, to profile the spending, to shift money between the years about the relative priority. And I guess the capital budget is a really good example of that, in that you get a big lump of capital and you really want to spend it, because if you don't spend it, you don't really have any way to say, well, hold on a minute, we'll hold on to that and we'll spend it in year 4 or 5, because no, you've got to spend it in your first year.
And we've had evidence from the Cabinet Secretary already that she doesn't expect the spending review to last. But we also had evidence last week from the various organisations in the public sector who are saying they still don't have sight of certainty of a budget. And so that spending review process performing its correct function in trying to add some form of certainty for allowing public services in particular to budget for their future and to give grant certainty if they're being told on one side it's not going to work, on the other side that actually doesn't give them that much certainty either.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the points about spending review, I think we said it was like a step forward, and the fact is at least broadly indicative outlooks for portfolios. That's better than what we've had in the past. But you could be a lot clearer about the specifics within there. So still publishing at level 2s, for example, what does that mean for individual public services, public bodies, third sector organisations? How do you really drill down into that detail and give them the certainty they need? We've also spoken, I think, about at the committee as well about, for me, the spending review is a way of planning the spending of government. It's not a one-off event. So it's how do you track exactly what's going, how are you giving more certainty and information over time, rather than, well, we've just published a number and that's a number and we've forgotten about it. It's the process is more important than actually the number, and that's where it's the tracking of that through the year is going to be really crucial.
Okay. All of which brings me probably back to where the conversation was earlier on, which is whether the current model is fit for purpose in a world of radical uncertainty, where data actually is not redundant, but it doesn't deal with black swan events, and where these are far more common. Is there a different model that you think the government could approach that would deal with actually the long term, trying to structure the devolved finances in the right kind of way to better deal with issues about radical uncertainty, given particularly you're highlighting as an institution some of these very long term trends around climate change, rate of technological progress, population dynamics. And I mean, I would postulate that those aren't the results of the radical uncertainty, but the causes of them globally. But so what are we doing to shift that balance? Or is there a different model that we could perhaps be probing with the government as to how they might approach the public finances to deal with that uncertainty?
It's a great question, and probably I'd like to have a think about that. There are a couple of things I would say just quickly. So one is, what matters in our framework is how that radical uncertainty was a disproportionate impact relative to the UK in many ways. Because there's a protection in there that, under the fiscal framework, that any shock that flows through both the UK and Scotland. So there's that mechanism of protection in there. So I think the key for me is what can you do to really beef up the MTFS within this context. So I get the fact that a budget document, given that it's so pressurised and it's all about the marginal changes, and it's when the government's setting out what they're actually exactly going to spend in 26, 27, I get it, that's really difficult to have some of these conversations and think about all of that there. But the MTFS was all meant to be all about setting out, well, these are things that we can be quite confident about. These are the priorities. Come back to Liz Smith's point about these are our 4 priorities. This is what we're doing. You could have an MTFS that looked radically different in terms of these are our 4 priorities. This is how much we're spending in these areas. This is the evidence that we've got. And that becomes much more a report card. It becomes much more a tracking of how the government are doing in terms of their relative priorities. It becomes more an assessment about whether or not their spending commitments are going to run ahead or not in there. So I think it would be about what could you do to come forward with a document that was published through the year that did exactly those sorts of things that you're talking about in terms of government trajectories, government plans, and didn't go into the short-term minutiae about, well, how your pay award's doing, or what are you thinking about tax, or how your tax revenue is going, but almost abstracted out into much more into well, you said you were going to do this is what you're spending, is it having the effect or not?
Because there's a reasonable consensus that we're looking at a low-growth, high-debt global context with huge uncertainty over the decade to come. It just feels to me that the political economy of driving budgets beyond their reality, trying to kind of balance no real foresight as to how we might plan to deal with the imperatives that sit underneath that, like climate change adaptation, Asian demographics, pace of change. It's like, does it not need a completely different model?
But I think that's where potentially things like the MTFS could be a way of doing it. So you're then really focusing on because ultimately, what are the levers the government have got in that space? It's on the spending side. The kind of revenue side and the funding side is largely, that'll be largely determined through the budget. It comes down to what you're spending that £60 billion on, and how you're spending that in a way which aligns to the priorities and these big challenges that you're talking about. That's the bit that I think is still to be filled, which speaks to the issues around spending reviews, details within spending reviews, allocations, evaluation about what is having an impact, what's not having an impact, what's the quality of the data that you've got that lets you address all of that. That strikes me as being, if you're looking at like a different model, is almost like a separate process that sits aligned and is connected to the budget, but is much more expansive in what it tries to drill into and look at.
Yeah. I empathise with your economic qualification situation. I've submitted my thesis 4 weeks before the collapse of Lehman Brothers in economics at the LSE, so I felt like I'd wasted all the money, frankly. But these questions, I think, the fact that we're all these years on and aren't really dealing with the consequence of it, but there is more for us to reflect in that area.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Of course, it's not just global events. I mean, we touched on the fact that the UK government's policy decisions are having huge impacts. I mean, a year ago we were facing potentially, an £800 million reduction because of what we thought were going to be disability cuts, which didn't take place. The mitigation of two-child cap we didn't think was going to happen. And then there was potentially a £1 billion loss because of income tax changes, and then with the NICS increases. So the UK government alone toyed with up to £2 billion of potential detriment to the Scottish budget. So that goes back to one of the cornerstones of the fiscal framework, which is no detriment. Yet, as we've already heard this morning, in the last year alone, there's been huge turbulence and uncertainty in Scotland's finances because they're clearly the no detriment aspect of the fiscal framework is not really being adhered to, is it? If the government can just, on a whim, reduce £1 billion from our budget, or if they decided to cut income tax, which of course they didn't. But
But from a technical point of view, that is no detriment, working in the sense that...
Yes, from a technical point of view,
yeah.
but in the reality, at the end of the day, we're like a ship, that can be tossed anyway in a storm,
Yeah, and I think there's two different points. There's one is, from a point of principle, if you put income tax up in England and Wales, should the Scottish budget benefit? The framework says no, because that's kind of having an impact in there. So it shouldn't happen. The broader point, is you're right, is into as well. Actually, if you've got these potential to pull these levers, perhaps unexpectedly, then how does the Scottish Government manage its budget when it says, well, we've got a commitment to reduce social security payments in England and Wales, so we plan on that basis, and then you're not doing it? Well, that has an impact on what we've got planned. Or you're toying with the idea of increasing income tax, but you never said you were going to do that. Now we have to work out. It's that budget management piece which is challenged. But the only thing I would say is, I don't think that counters the point that Michael Mara was making about that's all there as noise, but there's still stuff that you can do, which is you get £60 billion to spend. It might be 59 or it might be 60 and a half, but you still got all that money to spend. Are you spending that in the priorities that you really want to and achieve the outcomes that you're expected to? Because that won't change whether or not these movements are moving up or down or not.
I mean, we're still talking big numbers in terms of potential changes to the Scottish budget, whether it's up or down, and I think it makes it very difficult to plan long term when we've got that lack of stability. One of the things we're going to say on productivity, though, is, we talk about it and we talk about how it's looking fairly bleak, but are there any models overseas in a devolved context that we could look to, for example, to say, well, what are they actually doing in terms of productivity? I'm not talking about Singapore, which is a country with no resources and independent, that's increases per capita income some 60-fold over the last 60 years, whereas Scotland has managed to, which sounds ludicrous until we actually look at the figures, Scotland has managed it threefold in the same period. So there are countries that have done remarkably well from a poor base. But there are others that have, as you said, are in the same situation as us in Europe. Germany's having real difficulties economically, for example, as well. So where can we look to say, well, they're actually managing their economy effectively at a sub-state level?
I think we've got really good understanding about what drives productivity. The question is then how do you execute it in terms of what the effects are. So, a lot of that is, it's quite simple, it's education and skills. And the question is, are you educating your young people in a way that is then going to let them go into high productive jobs? Have you got a skills system that's fully aligned with the industry that you need to have, not just now, but into the future? And again, there's some really good examples on a sub-central level about where that does. So you look at some of the work that goes into some of the German landers about where they link up, for example, universities and apprenticeships much more with the industrial base. So you've got a much...
Just now.
At a level, which I was going to make the second point, which is so there's certain policy levers you can do around things that education and skills would do there. But the second bit is about what's happened to your sectors. And that has historically been where we've struggled because of the hollowing out of manufacturing and the move into lower productive sectors relative to our competitors. And Germany has always been the one that has done much better in there by having advanced manufacturing and doing really well there. Of course, why they're struggling is because those sectors are now not doing as well as they had done in the past. So things like automotive being lagging behind, the investment the Chinese companies into electric vehicles is having a disproportionate impact on them. So there's a bit about the levers you can pull, but then a second bit about the sectors and how can you, again, your government talked about the industrial strategy, but how can you actually get things like manufacturing? I know you've spoken a lot about Prestwick and the investment in manufacturing high quality jobs there. That's the sort of thing which drives productivity. And if you can do that at scale, then that has a potential disproportionate impact.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're well over time, actually, which is probably a good sign rather than a bad sign. It's always good when the committee's interested in what the Scottish Fiscal Commission has to say, which is, frankly, always. So I want to thank you very much on behalf of the committee for all that you've done over the last years to inform us. You've had a very important role to play, and while we all may, being pastors new post-May, I'm pretty sure you'll be back at this successor committee. So I'd like to thank you very much, and also it's important to have continuity, and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, I know, will continue to provide that.
Thank you.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
thanks
thank
again.
you.
Thank you.
I'm now going to call a 5-minute break to enable a changeover of witnesses. The next item on our agenda is an evidence session on the Scottish Government's Infrastructure Delivery Pipeline 2026, published last month. For this session, we are joined by Ian Hughes, Engagement Director, Scotland's Construction Industry Training Board, and Peter Reekie, Chief Executive of the Scottish Futures Trust. I'd like to welcome you both to the meeting, and we're grateful to you both for participating. We did invite other bodies who declined to participate, so your presence here is particularly welcome. So good morning to you, and we'll move straight to questions. I think the first thing I'll ask is, Peter, from your magnificent 143-page tome known as Long-Term Infrastructure for Scotland, Supporting a Sustainable and Thriving Future, published in January of this year. There's a number of things you touch on here. You touch on the 30-year infrastructure needs assessment, the Infrastructure Commission for Scotland, and also you talk about how the needs assessment aligns with Scotland's revised infrastructure investment framework to inform Scottish Government's draft 10-year infrastructure strategy, 26-27 to 2036-37. So I think to kick off, I wonder if you can just touch on where we are with this. It seems an awful lot of work has gone on, and an awful lot it seems to be quite a crowded space, shall we say. So where are we in terms of delivery of Scottish infrastructure?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for the invitation. It's always good to come and speak to the committee.
It's been far too long, Peter.
Nah.
Years.
It has been a while, yeah. Look, you're right, there's a lot going on, but these are all documents and publications that sort of sit together, if you like, to show a path of trying to get longer term in our infrastructure planning for Scotland. Sometimes we say this is a long-term game played in a short-term environment, right? We are trying to, with projects that take many years to deliver and very many years to plan, we need to begin to look further ahead and try and build a consensus about what Scotland needs into the future. So we were asked by government to independently look at that very long-term plan, taking it out generationally. We talk about infrastructure being a generational asset, and so we're trying to take a generational look. There is therefore very much uncertainty. We cannot say which hospitals, which roads, which schools we need to build over the next 30 years. But we can build a picture of what will be the drivers that across the infrastructure system that has to work together, not as a series of silos. What are the things that will impact across those infrastructure systems that would allow us to base our decisions on over that sort of longer term period? And we've identified key drivers, so the economic shape of Scotland and how that's changing and what we need for the economy, as well as our public services and public service reform, because we have economic infrastructure and we have social infrastructure that provides sort of the roof over public services, if you like. So those are kind of internal drivers that we make our own choices on. We have demographics, which is a big driver that Graham talked about, obviously, from all of our decision making, and some more specifically infrastructural drivers like climate change, which you've talked about as well, but also global security, which I wouldn't have been talking so much about as a driver even 3 or 4 years ago, but now I think is an impact across all infrastructure systems, not just defence infrastructure systems, but, for example, cybersecurity across all of our infrastructure. So we have those drivers, and then there are themes that will allow the infrastructure systems to work better together. So energy transition, again, you've talked about this morning already. Energy transition is not just a matter for the energy system. It's going to affect how we heat all of our buildings, our mobility. So it's a cross-system issue that needs to be planned all together. The nature positivity of our infrastructure systems, not just thinking about natural infrastructure, but thinking about nature positive solutions across all infrastructure and availability of nature, and for social infrastructure in particular, access to nature. Prioritising place, because all of our places across Scotland need different things. What we do at a national level, what we do at a regional level, what we do at a local level. How we use data and technology. Again, you've talked about that. There's much we can do to improve the use of data, the use of, we call them digital twins. So when you put sensors across your assets that help provide data to maintain and use the infrastructure better. Asset and climate resilience, so how much we're spending on maintaining our existing assets and enhancing those versus building new things. Hope we'll come back to that. I think it's a really important subject. All right, we'll come on to that then. Come on to that. And finally, I suppose for me, managing demand. As infrastructure folk, we're kind of predictors and providers in many ways, but we have lots of tools available across policy areas to think about influencing behaviour that will allow us to think differently about demand and using our influence, we can't direct in many cases, to help change the demand dynamics as well as just providing what's needed. So those are some common themes that we think will be there across that 30 years and will help us think longer term across the infrastructure system. So this is all about helping the big silos that have to operate as individually to think better together. That feeds into the government's infrastructure strategy, which is to look ahead at 10 years about what's the prioritisation framework and what's important over the next 10 years. That then again feeds into the delivery pipeline, which is looking at the spending review period, the next 4 years of what's actually going to happen. So we're trying to build the long-term picture that links to the mid-term and the short-term. And part of the consultation on the government's infrastructure strategy that's live at the minute is how those elements should fit together, and what the sector sees as the important elements of our long-term view that should be brought into those more immediate and prioritisation decisions.
I mean, I think, you know, from a layperson's perspective, I think what people see in terms of infrastructure projects, you know, is this, you know, that there's an awful lot goes into planning and a lot less than perhaps should be going into delivery. So, for example, we could, I don't think you'll be desperately keen to talk about specific projects. That's not really what we're necessarily wanting to do. But I remember, I think it was, you know, now Lord Cameron, who, when he was an MSP, asked about the consultancy fees that were spent on the Rest Me Thankful to that time, and it was something like £18 million in consultancy fees. Now, a lot of people like myself were shocked and thinking, well, you know, was some guy paid £1,000 a day, is equivalent of £18,000. Now, that may sound simplistic, but it seems a huge amount of money is going into planning, and projects are not being delivered as fast as they should be. And I think there's, you rightly touched about maintenance and delivery of projects, but one of the things we talked about in terms of the previous session, which you actually sat through, of course, was the fact that there are always seem to be cost overruns. There always seem to be delays in terms of delivering infrastructure projects in Scotland. Now, we see that in real terms, Scotland's going to have at least a 5% real terms reduction in capital available over the next 5 years. So we need more bang for our buck, not less. And we also have a situation whereby I'm probably asking too many things at the same time, but this is a beam my bonnet. Why is procurement costs so much more expensive in Scotland and the United Kingdom than comparative countries in Europe? I know you're smiling there, but you know it's true.
That's one of those sort of can you fix the world in one question type questions.
Oh, Peter, we've got so much confidence in you.
Well, you talk about the time spent up front. There's a sort of saying in major project delivery which is think slow, act fast. So I wouldn't decry anyone who spends a lot of time in project preparation. It's usually the right thing to do. I think that, you know, there's a lot of discussion around the place around our planning system.
I understand that, Peter, but to interject a minute, I've got an A737 project that has been on the planning board since 2004.
Yep.
You know, and it's supposed to be a development, a road safety project, and it's not vast. It's not the A9, yep. but I mean, 22 years. You know, I mean, it's beyond. And whenever you contact Transport Scotland, you get, oh, you know, there's this matter it has to go through. What's the kind of phrase they use? Government procedures. That's what you get. I mean, you try and find out what those procedures are, you know, you're up against a brick wall. So there's a level of frustration there. I know you think slow, but there's a difference between slow and comatose, I'm sure you'll agree. And Pete, I'm not trying to be amusing, I'm actually deadly serious about this. The lead time seems to be disproportionate sometimes to the work that requires to be done.
I think there's a really important point in there on how do we prioritise? So at what point do... I always see the project pipeline as a bit like a funnel. So it's not a long pipeline. It has the two elements, the wide sort of hopper-shaped bit at the top, where lots of people have ideas and priorities that they'd like to see happen. And then the narrow tube-like pipeline bit, where once we have made a decision and a business case has been approved and funding has been allocated, you move into delivery. And I think it's really important that that delivery element is efficient, effective, and moves through really quickly. But the projects that sit in the hopper bit at the top are still subject to prioritisation within a limited budget across the different sectors. And so we could say it would be better if nobody talked about any of the projects until we were certain that we knew that they were coming and the funding has been allocated and they were in the sort of the pipeline element. But then folks would say, well, we want more information about projects at an earlier stage. Very rightly, we should want more information at projects at an earlier stage. But we have to accept with that information at an earlier stage that there is uncertainty. Some projects will move through the hopper element really quickly because they're prioritised due to an asset failure maybe, or particular policy objectives. But some projects will sit in that wide element of the pipeline for a long time because they may be particularly important to some people and some stakeholders, but they never make it through the overall prioritisation. They may be taking a long time to get through a statutory or other planning process. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that because a project is something that is being talked about, it is just a linear process to get to then delivery, and that linear process is taking, as you say, a long time.
But when you've gone out to full consultation, when you've got no statutory objectors, etc., and people are encouraged to think something's going to happen and it doesn't happen year on year, the public who are ultimately paying for this do feel let down and disappointed. It just seems that if we were to actually go back, my view is I wouldn't be surprised if the cost of all this is actually, since 2004, and a specific project I'm talking about, is more than the cost of the project itself, which was 12 million quid, actually pretty modest, I would suggest. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that there seems to be much more bureaucracy, for want of a better word, in terms of the preparation of projects, which ultimately increase the cost and the delay to the delivery that everyone wants to see, whether it's housing, whether it's a school, whether it's a hospital road, whatever it happens to be. It's these that are frustrating with it. I mean, you'll have seen yourself how many umpteen times, for example, the A9 or whatever has been raised in the Parliament, and that's because members are genuinely just want to see things happen on the ground. So I'm asking you how we can expedite that process. I mean, I'm not talking about doing it in a week, but 10 or 20 years is a bit frustrating sometimes. And the huge cost of that, and how we can make procurement more efficient, more effective.
Well, you talk about acceleration, and you could look at it the other way around and say we spend all of our budget every year. So it's not possible to do more things sooner because we spend all the money, right? So the question you're asking, I suppose, is why do we start so soon on a project that is not prioritised to actually be delivered soon?
But that's only right if you accept that procurement costs are reasonable, and I don't think they are reasonable. Because
so we could do more with the budget available, is what you say? Yeah,
but so how do we get more bang from the buck we've got? Because procurement costs are disproportionately higher in the UK, obviously including Scotland, than they are in other countries. Clearly they are. I mean, I went to the Faroe Islands and I looked at the cost of their tunnels. 22-kilometre tunnel for €600 million. How much should it cost to build that year? How many billions?
Yeah, there's a lot of material on that around, as you well know. So some of that is about the planning process, some of it is about environmental mitigations, which are the right thing to do for the long term. Some of it is about, and one of the things that we're particularly keen on in SFT is delivering things as programmes. When we deliver as a programme, we get efficiencies. And if we do individual projects, then the sort of language of the sector is it's like a prototype in a muddy field every time. And that is quite an inefficient way to deliver. So we're keen on, for things like housing, and this is one of the reasons why we've thought about this really long term, is if you are able to start something and keep going. Some of the programmes in rail are perhaps a good example of that, where you do a repetitive process. That's what delivers the efficiency. So elements of standardisation of design, elements of moving into off-site manufacturing so that you can create assets in a industrial environment rather than on a construction site. But those are only possible if you can aggregate demand over a longer term and create a programme of activities. So there are ways to improve construction productivity overall, and skills is a big part of that. We'll no doubt come on to that. But creating programmes that we've thought for the long term, what we need, and that this activity, whether it be building new schools, building local care centres, whatever it may be, we're going to be doing 1, 2, 3 of these a year for the next 10 years. And we can really think about how to drive the efficiency out of that process through the procurement aspects and through the design and delivery. It is, for me, one of the big things that we could do better on productivity, which sort of is driven by that long-term planning aspect and how we do our prioritisation, but it would deliver some of the outcomes that you're looking for in terms of improving the pace and individual cost of assets.
Indeed. I'm going to come back to one or two of these things, obviously, but I think it's important, you know, that Ian Hughes gets an opportunity to say a few things. I mean, you know, we can talk about building this, we can talk about building that, but without the workforce, we can't really build anything. And so, obviously, the role of the Construction Industry Training Board and indeed the whole sector in terms of producing a skilled workforce is absolutely critical. So, I mean, you've said in your submission that in 24-25, over 6,500 people started a construction-related modern apprenticeship, more than a quarter of all new starts. 13,000 apprentices on training industry achieved a 78% completion rate. So these are all very positive now. Scotland is experiencing a record low in terms of its birth rate. That's going to feed through pretty soon. Are you confident that we will be able to provide the number of people, either young people themselves or indeed folk who are a bit slightly older or switching, to the construction sector to enable it to be able to provide the workforce across the range of skills that are required in the years ahead?
Yes, thank you. And again, thanks for kind of inviting me to the committee meeting. I think it's not an unreasonable question, but I think there is a misconception that there's a lack of supply of young people interested in entering into construction. There are huge numbers of young people aspiring to enter into the sector. There's a huge oversupply of young people wanting to enter into the sector. Where there's a mismatch is between the young people and what employers require in order to invest in people and to grow their business. Because, going back to the point made earlier, the private sector won't wait for the process. It won't wait for procurement. It will react when the opportunity arises, and it will invest in its people when the opportunity arises. So what you will see is a lack of investment if the pipeline isn't working efficiently.
If it's erratic.
And effectively, yeah. So you talk about the Modern Apprenticeship Programme, over 25% of those young people in particular, 16 to 19, coming from construction. We estimate for every one Modern Apprentice, there's 100 applications. Over and above the Modern Apprenticeship Programme, last year and this year there were between 45 and 50,000 learners within Scotland's FE sector studying engineering and construction, That's 50,000 young people over and above the Modern Apprenticeship Programme who were entering into college on a full or part-time course to study the two biggest sectors which will deliver the infrastructure programme for Scotland. That's a vast talent pool. And again, our research indicates as little as 25% of that pool gets employed within the sector to deliver things like infrastructure programmes in Scotland. So I think in terms of that flow, that pipeline, we call it a leaky pipeline. There's too many people entering in at the beginning and not going through the pipeline to be gainfully employed within a very, very powerful career opportunity, which is construction in the built environment.
But are there skill gaps? Because when I look at when I speak to people from businesses and stuff like that, they say there are specific skill shortages. I mean, welders, for example, one of my a steel fabricator in my constituency, for example, is taking people who've been long-term unemployed, and they're putting them through a 15-week kind of advanced welding course with qualifications, etc. And they tend to be people in their late 20s and 30s, even older. So although there may be a number of people in construction, are there gaps where there are particular difficulties? And geographically, do we have the people where we need them? Because I mean, obviously, there's not some huge workforce, in rural Perthshire, for example, working in A9. They all have to move there, at least temporarily. So how do we deal with those kind of issues in terms of the pipeline provision?
Yeah, I think in terms of the skills gaps, the biggest request from industry, can we get more new entrants? And when I ask employers, okay, I can give you a 16, 17-year-old with no qualifications, no experience, 9 out of 10 will say no. I need a level of competency from that young person before I will employ them. They don't have to be fully competent. They don't have to have served 3 or 4 years worth of training, but they need a level of competency from the education system or the FE sector. That's what the industry is telling us is lacking at the present time. They need more competent new entrants. And I think in terms of that skills gap, I like to flip it, basically. So a skills gap basically is a supply and demand model. What you have are job opportunities. So if you need 1,000 plumbers and you're only training 800, there's still 1,000 jobs, but there's 200 vacancies will go unfilled. So I think it's important that the research that is produced, the evidence that is produced, identifies occupations and geographies where the biggest pinch points will come. And our research is showing the biggest pinch points in Scotland will be at the Highlands and Islands and South East, which is Edinburgh, Lothian. And that's based on our 5-year modelling. 60% of industry contracts will be through procurement in Scotland. It's maybe slightly higher than that one. So we're pretty accurate in determining over a 5-year period where the investment will go, what the demographics are in that area, and what occupational shortfalls will be happening within those areas. And it's interesting when you look at the makeup of the sector in Scotland. 3 big sectors: infrastructure, which we're here to discuss, house building, both social and private, and repairs and maintenance, roughly 33% each.
All is infrastructure, to be honest, because I think maintenance is an issue which is really, really important, actually, as well. And of course, house building, record investment going in there. And of course, in terms of what you're doing in terms of construction, they're all vital, obviously.
Yeah. But when you look at the makeup of who delivers those particular aspects of the sector, it's very, very different. Again, 96-97% of all companies in Scotland are SMEs and micros. Mm-hmm. So they won't be delivering roads, they won't be delivering hospitals, they won't be delivering big infrastructure projects. They'll be predominantly within repairs and maintenance, or perhaps part of a supply chain, the kind of comet. You've got the lead contractor and the big supply chain, right down to the one individual specialist who does something that no one else does. So I think in terms of that breakdown in Scotland of that predominant SME and micro kind of company size, it does beg the question, which certainly we're asking more and more when we have discussions such as this: does that sector have the capability to respond to the investment that's coming through the pipeline in Scotland, or should we be relying on the tier ones and the medium-sized companies who can suck in some of those SMEs and micros to deliver specific areas? So the capability is a big assumption, because if you make an assumption that the economy, or the private sector is capable of delivering the projects in the time and cost as laid out through procurement, that's a big assumption to make. And I think we need to have a longer discussion about how do we engage more with the SME and micro sectors in particular and get them into that delivery pipeline.
I mean, you've said basically in paragraph 13 of submission, you've said Scotland's SME network requires a longer-term pipeline for work beyond 4 financial years. But how realistic is that, given the kind of global uncertainties that we have and financial uncertainties? So, for example, in the current financial year, we're at a 14% increase in capital, but it's going to be declining over the next 5 years. So it's going to be effectively the same in 2030 in real terms that it was 23-24. So we've not really advanced that much. So how can we actually deliver that for that level of certainty?
I think there's only one probable area of confidence you can give, and that's the procurement process itself, because if you have a framework agreement in place and you're looking to tie contractors down, for a 5-10 year period to give that confidence of delivering stuff, tying in the SMEs and micros into that pipeline and giving them the confidence to know that they will be subcontracted, they will be part of the longer term journey, will give them the confidence to invest in their people and their infrastructure. I think that's the only way you can look at those longer term, because we all know small contractors, we've all worked with them. The average workflow for a very small contractor, 6 months. They kind of know they've got 6 months worth of work. They probably don't know they've got 12 months. They probably can't see that further ahead. So that's a kind of micro small business issue for all sectors, not just construction. So you need to bring them in to the tent, as it were, and basically ensure that the lead contractors and the medium-sized contractors are bringing in these SMEs and micros for that longer term period, because I think that's the only way, certainly from my opinion, that in terms of public sector spending, you can actually make that happen. You can't really make it happen in terms of what the private sector, what individuals in Scotland spend on their windows and the roofs and repairs and maintenance. That's a kind of...
And in terms of the SMEs, what is the balance between the work they do in the private sector and the public sector?
Probably, when I say probably, it will be more private sector. It'll be more basically, especially within repairs and maintenance, in terms of domestic repairs and maintenance. They will be working with, we all kind of know that, so they'll be working in their communities, first and foremost. If they're part of a supply chain, again, they'll be working within a reasonable travel distance. Gone are the days of small contractors jumping in a minibus and going down to London. It doesn't happen anymore. It's 30-mile maximum travel distance for...
We've got a good roofer for Cumnock, actually.
Well, and it's a lifestyle. It's a lifestyle choice. People are making lifestyle choices. Why shouldn't they? If the work is further than 30 miles, it becomes less economically viable for them. I think so. Most of the SME and micro companies in Scotland will be in your communities fundamentally, and they won't venture further afield. And
Ian, you've talked about investment in the modern apprentices will insufficient to meet industry skills demand. You've touched on that. So you talked about new pathways. Can you be specific about some of these new pathways? I know there's obviously graduate apprenticeships as well and various other things, but what kind of new pathways would you be thinking about there?
I think we're at a tipping point in terms of on one hand, the high cost of delivering modern apprenticeships over mainly a 4-year period, which is lengthy. Again, for an SME and micro, it's a lengthy time period, and an increasing amount of requests from industry to look at additional routes into the sector. So additional routes over and above apprenticeships would be which level of training or upskilling or competency can we provide within an established environment such as the FE sector. How can we provide those additional routes into the sector? Because it's not our job as a training body to take an individual through a career path. We can assist at certain pinch points. It's the employer. It's the employer who will take their staff on that career journey, and that individual can leave, can set up their own business, can do what they want. But I think in terms of that kind of aspect of where we do that, for me, we have a hugely impressive FE sector in Scotland. I think we need to be utilising that as much as possible in terms of those additional routes into the sector as well. It's about competency. It's not about... And the role that training and qualifications can play in competency is significant, because I think that link between the skills landscape and the training landscape has to be stronger in terms of economic and social output. I don't think we've got it, basically, at the present time. I'll go back to my statistic of training 45,000 engineers and construction people at college, and they're not getting jobs in those sectors. So they're not having the economic and social output. I would suggest the policies that the Scottish Government are designing and implementing are requesting for, and that includes things like house building, net zero, and the big infrastructure plans as well. So I think the regional planning model, whereby you have a stronger alignment between what has been trained and taught and educated in terms of, and aligning that to the pipeline of work that's coming through within that region, needs to be better, and it's not very good at the present time.
Well, thank you for that. That's actually very helpful. Peter, you're not a big fan of the mutual investment model, are you, really? I mean, so basically the The Scottish Futures Trust in 2019 found that mutual investment model is significantly more expensive, 2.6 to 3.3 times the construction costs over 25 years of the asset, and I know it's been rejected for the A9, compared to 1.9 to 2.6 times the construction of financed by public borrowing, and an asset funded using a capital grant to maintain to the same standard over 25 years, estimated to 1.5 times the construction cost. So it's something like the mutual investment model. Is that something you would reject, or is there any specific circumstances where you feel that it's the only game in town? It's kind of shades of PFI, PPP for me, I have to be honest.
It's a form of public-private partnership.
Indeed,
right?
Of course it is.
And the paper we did in 2019 was not intended to say, we're against it and for it. It was intended to increase the transparency over the approaches that can be taken and the costs associated with those approaches. Now, the approach we used previously was called the non-profit distributing model, and we could go back in this committee for years and talk about that, but that was found to be classified to the public sector by Eurostat at the time, ONS's responsibility now. So it didn't give what is critical in Scotland, which is additionality of ability to invest in capital infrastructure and pay for that with long-term resource budgets when there is limited capital budgets now. So we were trying to show if you do want to do that, if you want to build infrastructure now and pay for it out of long-term resource budgets, because I always say pay as you build or pay as you use, but pay you must. So if you want to do that, then this route is available. It meets the classification requirements, and there's a cost implication of doing it. So that's a decision for government, for politicians to make. We can help implement those projects and programmes. We know the commercial mechanisms. We know how to go about the procurements. We know the criteria for project selection that make good projects to deliver that way. But I'm not going to say I'm a fan of it or not a fan of it. I just want to be really clear on that it can be done and what are the implications of doing that.
Okay, I've got two more questions. I mean, I've actually got loads, but I've got colleagues who want to come in. How do you decide the balance between maintenance and new project delivery? So, for example, after 2008 crash, the then Chancellor Sir Darling cut Scotland's capital allocation by 40%. That was subsequently reduced to a 20% dip, as you'll recall. And the Scottish Government did actually put resource into capital of some 500 million to try and restore that. Now, at that time, it was said that half of all the money available for capital spend was just on care and maintenance, really. So it meant the amount of new projects that were going to be delivered was massively down. But if if you drive along the roads in Scotland, for example, and you look at other public infrastructure, I mean, bridges, whatever it happens to be, there's real concerns about the fact that they're not really up to scratch in many areas. And you can argue about the whole size of the cake. But how do you decide to say, look, we really need to spend X% on maintenance before we even think about new projects? Where is that balance? How do you strike that balance, Peter?
So I think that's something that we could be better at, if I'm honest. I would say you've got to maintain what you have first. Right? And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything should last forever, because there are some times that an asset might not be suitable for the future need, so there's no point in continuing to maintain it. So there is a balance to be struck, but there was a commitment in the 2021 infrastructure investment plan to double the spend in maintenance in some sectors. I think that's really important. It's very difficult to draw out the data on what's been spent on maintenance, because these are small individual projects that are not covered individually in the pipeline information that is published. So I think data is definitely an issue. We should have asset management plans for all of our key infrastructure assets that show what the condition of that asset is and what the long-term future of that asset is. Do we plan to keep it? Do we plan to change its use? And what's the cost of maintaining it? You'll hear the phrase backlog maintenance used in a lot of the time. Backlog maintenance is an important characteristic, but we need to understand what the long-term future of that asset is as well, and whether the backlog maintenance includes, for example, painting the walls in a building, which we can choose to do or choose not to do, or whether it includes, whether it's replacing a boiler where actually if you don't replace it, it will start failing very regularly and affect the service delivery. So I would say that we should be thinking more across the sectors, and that's what we're trying to help bodies do, is think about their asset strategies and their asset management plans to have those built out over a longer period of time, so that we can understand collectively what the maintenance need is of our asset base. Because of, I suppose, the stages of development of society and its assets, we are in a phase now where we have a lot of ageing infrastructure assets that we're still using to provide important services for people. And there's the failure
Victorians
rate,
built them well, to be fair.
Yeah, but the failure rate isn't linear, right? So there's a failure thing, it's called a bathtub curve, and things fail when they're brand new because you haven't quite got it right and it's settling in. And then they're really steady for a long period of time. Everything's fine, don't need to do much to it. And then the failure rate suddenly increases at the end, so it's shaped like a bathtub. And for many of our assets, we're just approaching that phase where they're going to begin to start failing. So we need to start thinking about spending more on maintaining ageing infrastructure, on preventative maintenance. That's where the points I made before about how we use sensor technology, and I know a lot of sectors are thinking about that, so we can get better at predictive maintenance. But if you imagine the capital budget overall, you could think about that being built up from nothing, what we need to maintain we've got already, what we could be using for new or extending, and then what we need to leave at the top because things occur and you just need to leave a bit of space, like I was saying before, for things that might occur and there's fluctuations in these things. So building up budgets in that way within organisations and across is something that I think is really important.
Okay, thanks. Well, demand for capital exceeds supply, so you must find it frustrating when each year there seems to be projects that are delayed to the extent that the capital budget is not fully spent. Should there not be more emphasis on shovel-ready projects, for example, resurfacing roads or whatever it happens to be, that can be done at a relative short term to avoid that? And I go back to my initial question, which is how do we, because the SFC have highlighted it as well, how do we stop or how do we reduce the likelihood of cost overruns in procurement and delays, sometimes for years? And it's not just a Scottish thing. I mean, a friend who's a quartermaster down in, HS2, and he says, to get things done, they've been told, just do things, money's no limit, all that kind of stuff. Whether that's true or not, I can't say. But there's real concerns about delivering things on time and on budget. And we're not talking about 3 or 6 month delays. We're talking about years sometimes and huge cost overruns. So how do we keep that in control, and how do we ensure that we optimise the capital budget to best effect?
A couple of elements to that. Maybe for me, one is this handling of uncertainty, because these are big lumpy elements of spend that are more difficult to predict in time, and the impact of delay on them is more across year ends than it is in service delivery, where the spend is a lot more linear, I guess. So your point on having smaller projects that are often maintenance that are able to bring forward, that relies on budget management and people knowing when and where these sort of excess budget is likely to occur. But it also depends on how we manage contingency. And managing contingency is all about managing uncertainty and communicating uncertainty in a way, because if you want a project not to overrun its budget, you make sure that you've got a big budget that contains a lot of contingency. In the event that that contingency isn't needed, then it's been held in one budget line and it's really difficult for someone else to use it. So doing things on time and on budget mitigates, or being able to show that you've done it on time and budget mitigates against sort of good budget management across. If you hold your contingency at the level of an overall portfolio of projects, or the overall portfolio of projects, then you have to accept that some projects within the portfolio will spend a little bit more than was originally intended, and some might spend a little bit less. But within the overall portfolio contingency, you'll be able to manage that. So how we handle uncertainty at different levels between different budget holders is I'm not trying to pretend this is easy. This is really, really difficult to get right, what you hold at a local level and what you hold at a higher level in the system. But that management of uncertainty, communicating the uncertainty, because if you don't hold contingency on every individual project, there will be projects that perform differently according to their budget, is critical to it.
One teensy one more. What proportion of actual projects are delivered on time and on budget?
I don't know. I'm not going to try and answer that for you just now.
Is it most, or is it a teensy-weensy number, or whatever? What? Because what we don't want is a situation whereby it's almost accepted that projects are going to overrun and be over budget. I mean, if something's got a budget and a delivery date, that should be when it should be completed. I remember, there's some projects in the private sector, at least, I imagine public sector, I'm not an expert in procurement, would have penalty clauses if you don't deliver them on time.
I mean, I agree, but if you look at the last 5-year period, 2021-2026, first quarter, we've seen 25% construction inflation over that period.
We have,
and projects will last that length of time. So it's not a surprise that projects that were budgeted before that period of time are now costing more than they were budgeted. We have not been able to predict that level of inflation. So some of it is a feature of the current circumstances. And I don't want to use that as an excuse, because the generality of your point is still a good point. But at the minute, it's particularly difficult to get cost certainty.
John, to follow by Liz.
After 41 minutes, I get to ask a question. No, I was counting. So I'm completely surprised. So on the actual infrastructure delivery pipeline which we have, and also the infrastructure, the development and future pipelines, do they give enough detail, do you think, for either of your sectors to move forward?
Shall I start?
On you go.
Yeah. So for many purposes, they don't give enough detail, but they give a very understandable level of detail for where we're at the minute. And I'll use an example in there. One line in that infrastructure delivery pipeline is the £4 billion budget for affordable housing. Now, every construction contractor would want to know, when's the project coming that I'm interested in? What part of the country are those projects going to be delivered in? What's the skills? And Ian will no doubt talk about that. We've responded to the industry's demand for more detail on that with a pipeline database that currently contains 1,192 projects, as it happens, but over 50% of those projects are less than £2 million. And the threshold for the delivery pipeline is £5 million. So a lot of little projects are what industry, individual companies are interested in. So there's not a complete overlap in the scope of those two sources of information. So we go out to all public bodies. Most of them respond. So we have a lot of local authority projects in the database. That is really useful for locally based companies to know exactly what the project is in their area. And our database, I suppose, is more searchable. So if you're a contractor that's interested in providing a particular piece of equipment that's useful in schools, then you can filter our database by when are all the schools projects coming across Scotland. So there are ways of having increased granularity, but that then changes more frequently and has less certainty associated with it. I think industry's very comfortable with that. They kind of understand that things change, but it's probably not at that level of granularity a good way to deliver accountability at the sort of level that you guys are looking to.
I'll come to Mr. Hughes in just a second.
So
I think the committee had expected or was hoping for a bit more detail, and the split between the I keep getting my titles mixed up, delivery pipeline and the development and future pipelines. Yeah. And I mean, the development and future pipelines, it appears that, these are just things we hope to do one day. I mean, it's no more not much more detailed than that, is it?
Well, I would say those are projects that are, I mean, the diagrams in the document show what stage they're at, but for me that's that wider part at the top of the funnel, because before you've had a business case approved and funding allocation, then the place in that project in the prioritisation queue is not clear, and because you don't know when it's happening in time, and time is money, you can't tell exactly how much it's going to cost. So there is a substantially increased level of uncertainty for projects pre that business case stage, so there's less information being provided on them, but you'd have to ask others about the detail of what might be available on those.
Okay. So, Mr Hughes, infrastructure delivery pipeline, is that enough for you or not enough for you?
Not enough, certainly for industry partners. I think to put it in context, in Scotland we have only around 75 Tier 1 companies, which is the PLC or big family-owned businesses, and around 75 medium-sized companies. That's all. These are the companies that will deliver the infrastructure plan, excluding companies that are based in England who may come up and procure or be part of a bigger agreement. So that small pool of delivery companies that we have in Scotland, they need detail and they need clarity in terms of where and when do they come in to the process. Because I think it's the process that drives the reaction, isn't it? It's a process that a company will decide, yeah, there's a lot happening in the Highlands and Islands. It's mainly going to be roads. I'm using that as an example. You know, we're a civil engineering company. Yeah, we're going to invest and we're going to go after these contracts with one or two partners or the supply chain. Not all of those 150 companies in Scotland will tender. Not all of them are in framework agreements, so you're actually lowering the number again. So the smaller the number of delivery companies you have based in Scotland who provide that economic and social benefit we're talking about, you know, the more difficult it is for them to react quickly if things are switched on.
So the fact that the total capital expenditure, well, it's maybe going up a little bit at the moment, but then it's just going to be fairly steady for the next few years, that's not really enough detail because the companies are more specialised than that, is that?
I think the detail in terms of them making investment decisions is probably suffice, just in terms of it gives them the confidence that these things will be procured over the 10-year period. That doesn't necessarily mean they will invest within their business quickly, but it will give them the confidence that they will establish bases in Edinburgh or the Highlands or Inverness, and they will continue working in these areas, or they will gear up at a certain point to move into the areas to deliver some of the big infrastructure projects. So I think if you were asking a chief exec, it's probably a question for CEOs of big companies in Scotland. What is the trigger point that gives you the confidence that you will be locating and delivering projects in a certain geography in Scotland? You know, I think that's a question. If you had 2 or 3 CEOs in the room, you would get a much stronger response, I think, in terms of what their business model is and how they respond to the opportunities. Okay,
but your specialism is more like the modern apprenticeships and things like that. I mean, have you got numbers for like how many? I'm not sure how many modern apprenticeships there are at the moment. Have you got a kind of target that there should be more, or is that too simplistic a question?
No, it's not simplistic. I think we would all like more, but there is a big issue, I think, in terms of the funding model. It's a funded model basically, so then the numbers are stipulated by the funding. So at the present time, Skills Development Scotland holds the MA funding programme. That's moving to the Funding Council over the next 12 months, as you know, via the reform legislation. So I think in terms of that budget, which drives the numbers, that's not really a demand-led model, is it? That's basically saying we have a budget, we can provide funding for 6,000 construction and engineering apprenticeships, and we want them to be based in North, South, East and West Scotland. That's the direction we are given. It's no more specific than that necessarily.
And are you saying this, if the number was 6,000, are you saying it should be 9,000 or 12,000, or have you not got, a number?
I think, I'll go back to a point I made earlier, it should be stronger aligned to the economic output that the government's trying to achieve, whether it's infrastructure investment or whether it's social investment within schools and hospitals, for example. Because at the present time, we can provide you with occupational shortfalls, and they tend not to be apprentices, they tend to be more specialist occupations than a kind of craft or a trade apprentice. But at the present time, if I said we want 10% more modern apprentices, I think the college system would struggle to deliver 10%. I think what the message we're getting is we are maxed out Basically, it's unsustainable. It uses a lot of real estate, a lot of costs, a lot of investment. If you increase it by 10%, you're going to have to increase the budget, the government budget, accordingly, and then a bit some.
And could you put a figure on how much that would have to be increased? Or
we estimate, and we're working closely with the Funding Council to try and find out how much does it cost to deliver an apprenticeship in Scotland. We don't know. Our estimate is in terms of public sector investment, and this is where it's a messy landscape. There's three investors within craft apprenticeships in Scotland. There is Skills Development Scotland through the management agency, who also invest within the colleges to deliver. There is the Scottish Funding Council, who provide the colleges with credits over and above the Skills Development Scotland. And if you're in scope to CITB, you get substantial grant support from CITB. So we estimate that comes in about £40,000 to £50,000, depending on where you are, per apprentice.
And presumably that varies a lot depending on what the skill is, does it? Or if
the payments are the same for any sector.
Right.
Every sector is paid the same credit, more or less. There are nuances geographically.
And I don't want to go off the subject too much, but do you think the Tertiary Education Act will help simplify that because you're putting the SFC and the SDS bit together?
I'd hope so. Yeah. Yes, I would hope so, because I think in terms of, bearing in mind, industry doesn't care about all this stuff, frankly. It's behind them. It's somewhere. They want a simple system. And I think we need to put front and centre the learner journey within this whole skills landscape, the 16 to 17-year-old who enters into a professional career. If that journey isn't as smooth as it needs to be, we will lose them, and we do lose them, and we lose them in big numbers in the first year in particular. So I think in terms of making it a simpler landscape and a better learner journey, you will retain more people and you'll get greater economic output at the end of the day.
Okay. And the other area I wanted to touch on was what the convener already asked about this mutual investment model. And I confess I'm a bit sceptical about it because, I mean, you said certain things earlier on, like, for example, it meets the classification requirements. Yep. Well, it might do today, but, I mean, tomorrow, who knows, the ONS or somebody might change it because, I mean, I'm an accountant and the danger is that accountants, they look for a loophole. We've found the MIM, that's a loophole, and then the rules just get changed again to squeeze it out. Because, I mean, anything we do, it's effectively debt, whether we're paying for it today or paying for it over 20 years, isn't it?
Now, as you're an accountant, you'll know it creates a future repayment obligation. Yes. Whether it's classified as debt is another issue. But I mean, you're right that we rely on the stability of the rule books to the same as the fiscal framework overall, to design the way that the budgets are, the way that the budgets are used. The classification of what's resource spending and what's capital spending is tricky. It depends on very particular rule books. You might say the same thing for whether maintenance spend should be capitalised or whether maintenance spend should be taken out of resource spend. There's a whole series of rules and regulations around that at one point you are very close to the edge of a rule. That's the way the rules operate. So you're right to say that there are lots of different ways to see this. All we can do is say that under the current rule book, as we understand it, this is how it would operate, and we have been to ONS and tested that.
But all of these models are more expensive than if we either take it straight out of the tax or slightly more expensive if we borrow traditional borrowing, aren't they?
Yes, so delivering this additionality has a cost associated with it, and I suppose that's why in the schools programme we originally used privately financed models, PPP approach. We've changed that to an outcomes-based funding model with local authorities that is now able to use the local authorities' financial capacity. Whether they choose to borrow or not is a matter for the individual local authority. But the government then contributes long-term resource budgets for those schools, and that resource comes with the obligation to keep the building well maintained. Mm-hmm. In the case of the more recent schools, it comes with the need for that building to be energy efficient. So we've led to a step change in the energy efficiency of new schools buildings through that funding model. But there are different funding models that use either private finance or public finance that can allow the Scottish Government to pay for the assets out of long-term resource budgets rather than capital budgets now, and it is about how much additionality ministers and others want to deliver, and how they prioritise long-term resource spending versus capital spending now.
Yes. Because I think, is it your figures that said that if you use traditional borrowing, or no, if you use grant, then the total cost, including maintenance, is 1.5 times.
Yeah.
Whereas in other cases it can go up to 2.6 or 3.3 times.
In the order, yes. So
yes.
The finance is a significant proportion of the overall life cycle cost, but we shouldn't forget the maintenance piece. And if we build an asset and then fail to maintain it properly and it has a shortened life, then that has a cost and a service delivery implication as well. So there is an actual benefit in locking in the maintenance spend as we construct the assets. So you could argue that we should be able to do that ourselves and allocate budget to maintenance, but you will know from across the public sector that that's not necessarily done as well as it could be. So it is an advantage to lock in the maintenance. But as you say, there is a cost associated with that.
It does then mean it's ring-fenced, doesn't it? And so
exactly, yeah.
The school might be maintained, but the road outside, the councils can't afford to maintain it.
Absolutely. It takes it out of the general prioritisation pot and makes it an asset-specific to say, if we're going to build this thing, then we really ought to allow the budget to maintain it. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks very much. Thanks, Convener.
57 minutes, John. Liz to be followed by Michelle.
Just before I come to my main question, Mr Hughes, could I just ask you about something you said in relation to the college sector when you were replying to the convener? I thought it was a very interesting comment that you made, that there is out there a vast pool of considerable talent and that the sector is doing a really good job to try to harness that talent. I entirely agree with that. You mentioned, however, that you didn't feel that the responses within different regions to the demand for the skills that are required were as good as it used to be. And I would certainly also agree with that, because when I came into this Parliament 20 years ago, the local colleges were extremely good at picking up what the local demand was in a very small local community. Can I just ask you, why do you think that it's not as good as it should be in picking up that local demand?
It's variable to start with, I think. I wouldn't like to generalise. Some colleges have a tremendous relationship with their employers in a kind of local setting. Others a bit more distant, I would suggest. And it's about that relationship with employers fundamentally, in terms of bearing in mind a young person, if they're doing an apprenticeship, will be spending 26, 28 weeks in a college environment full time. So that means they're not working with their employer. You know, they're being taught the theory and and some practical aspects of the job, but the employer's they're not being productive with the employer. So the employer needs to trust the college environment to be doing the right thing at the right time, and bringing the young person back into the workplace with more skills and more capability. And I think in terms of where it seems to be lacking is where that does work pretty well, but where it seems to be lacking is, in my opinion, most employers don't see the FE sector as a recruitment portal. They don't utilise it as a recruitment pool as much as I think they either could do or should do. And there's a piece of work for a number of parties, including ourselves, in that space. Some employers will, but when you talk about the number, the tens of thousands of learners who are studying construction who don't enter into a job, we need to scratch the surface and find out why is that happening.
Do you think that's a lack of knowledge about what is happening in the college sector, or do you think there's a deliberate policy to try to use other pools of talent before you come to the college sector?
We'll give a response from an employer's viewpoint. In many cases, they don't see learners coming through both school and FE sector as having the competency levels they require. And in some cases, that could be things like attitude or aptitude. Yeah. The biggest reason for apprentices leaving in year one in Scotland in the construction sector is discipline.
Yeah.
Not turning up, missing the transport, wanting to leave early, lots of different reasons. And that brings us back to the recruitment process of young people, because if the recruitment process is informal, which it is in construction, it's a tap on the shoulder. Do you want to be an apprentice? And you'll never stop parents asking their son or daughter to join the family business. We're not saying that. but there's a very, very high percentage of informal recruitment. So you're bringing a young person into a construction sector with no prior experience, no vocational experience, no knowledge whatsoever, just think it's a good thing. And then suddenly in November, it's not a good thing. It's 6 in the morning and you're on a roof, basically. I'm out here, basically. Or I'm just not going to turn up again. So the short life working group that the Scottish Government has stood up, which we are part of, is looking at 2 areas of the pipeline. We're looking at how do we retain more apprentices, perhaps looking at pre-apprenticeship programmes, and how do we get more FE learners through the pipeline and into employment. And that group is looking at solutions to bring back to government around May of this year.
So what do we have to do to ensure that there are more young people who have the self-discipline and the soft skills that you're talking about?
Every indication we have in terms of our experience with learners and with employers indicates that they need to be involved in the sector of choice at an earlier point in their career pathway. And that should really, if possible, it almost goes back to vocational training at school. It should start in the secondary school, but it should continue through the FE sector if that's where they go. Because that huge pool we're talking about are coming straight from school. You know, they get 50,000 1 minute in school, next minute they're in college. But the experience, the tasters, the work experience, the introduction to construction isn't really happening at a level, because construction, it sounds a bit obvious, it's an incredibly technical, highly skilled profession, irrespective of where you are within the sector, and the career opportunities are aligned to that. So if you don't have some type of knowledge or experience, and that works both ways, because I would rather a young person had the experience and then said, this is not for me, because if you stop them entering into the system and the cost that goes with it, and then they drop out after 18 months, it's an emotional charge and it's a financial charge as well. So it's basically that kind of, how quickly can we get young people getting the taster experience, getting the work experience. I think employers will step up to the mark to provide that within a controlled environment. But for me, that's part of the solution. There's no doubt.
What you're really saying is it's an issue in schools, because the younger that we can ensure that young people have these aspects of self-discipline and understanding what the workplace is right.
Just look at the numbers of people who are applying for apprenticeships and who go to college. Tens of thousands want a job in construction. But there is a mismatch there somewhere.
Okay, that's helpful.
Can I add the sort of overall structure of the industry point to that as well? And that to link it back to the pipeline point, Ian's talked about a lot of employment sitting in SMEs, and for the domestic scale business, that's the structure of the industry, right? But for larger scale construction, a lot of the employment still happens in SMEs that don't, by their very nature, they take on maybe one apprentice every so often, and they don't have the organisational capacity to do the good recruitment, etc., that Ian has talked about. If we have a longer-term pipeline and clarity of work, we have some of the larger contractors that will be able to hold more labour themselves and have the good systems and processes that are needed to be able to do that. We've got some fabulous, probably not the main contractors, they're principally integrators, but the big trade subcontractors that hold a lot of labour, they employ people in their organisations, are probably the best at running some of these schemes, but they need a long-term pipeline of work to be able to grow and scale. Otherwise, they just employ SMEs that provide labour only into the system. So the link between the pipeline is not just visibility, but it allows the overall structure of the industry to change.
Thank you both for these comments. Very, very helpful, although also quite worrying. My other point was related to a comment that the Deputy First Minister, Kate Forbes, rightly in my opinion, said last summer when she was citing the fact that to have really good quality infrastructure development in Scotland for the future, we needed to have very good collaboration between the public and private sectors. They need to work together. And that I think the implication was that perhaps they're not working as well as they should be. Could you just outline for us what you think the challenges are with regard to that collaboration? Are there things that we should be doing to improve that?
I'll give a quick response. I think the best examples of collaboration in my experience are when you can co-design aspects of work between the private sector and the public sector. there's a line in the sand where when you introduce a co-design process, but co-designing systems and processes that will ultimately be built by one of your partners, for me, is a tried and trusted way of basically ensuring the private sector knowledge and experience and skills are aligned to the public sector skills. I think at the present time it's seen as a public sector process, and then the private sector as a delivery. And there's some framework agreements in terms of the hub model might be slightly better evolved than that. Maybe Peter can comment. But from my kind of knowledge of the large companies and medium-sized companies, the sooner you can bring them in to the system in terms of that co-design type approach. Now, I know that's difficult in a commercial world, a competitive world, but we do have framework agreements, we do have systems established whereby you can speak to 6 big companies. And I think it's worth also remembering those. A big company in Scotland in construction might have 1,000 staff on the payroll, but with 10,000 staff in that pipeline. So that's where co-design becomes interesting, because that's a vast economic and social benefits, not just the company itself, it's what its pipeline is doing to deliver the infrastructure projects.
Thank you.
I would say, I've got a number of levels for this. I think it's a really good point. The piece there is about the private sector as a supplier of construction services and design services. And yes, giving them predictability, co-designing things. And we have the Construction Leadership Forum, which tries to bring together the public sector and industry into those areas of improvement. So transformation of the industry, we're looking at things like skills. I think Ian's a member of one of the groups, but looking at procurement and trying to think about procurement from both the procured side and the procurer's side, fair work, modern methods of construction, net zero. So we do have groups that are looking with the supply, and we can be better at that. The next level for me is the private infrastructure operators. So there are the electricity companies, the communications companies that are private buyers and clients for the infrastructure sector. And there, a lot of the interaction is about regulation, and quite a lot of that regulation is UK government regulation. So again, I think it was mentioned in the earlier session by Graham that joint working between the levels of government on how that regulation affects the pipeline of projects and what those companies do in Scotland is really important, but also increasing the transparency of their private sector pipelines alongside our public sector pipelines to understand whether we're doing things in a coherent way or have hotspots of investment because a private infrastructure provider is putting something in at the same time in the same place as a private infrastructure provider. And I suppose the final level for me is overall private sector, I would call it development activity, where there are sometimes infrastructure blockers that are stopping that private sector investment and development going ahead, and understanding through the national planning framework and through sort of infrastructure first approach where the capacity is in the infrastructure system to support development, and where actually there is an infrastructure blocker that we could invest in infrastructure to facilitate development is another area of important. So it happens at all of these levels, as well as the sort of investment and private financing of public infrastructure, along with increasingly with things like the National Investment Bank, the public financing of private infrastructure. So there are links at the financial level, but at the practical levels as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, to be followed by Patrick.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us. How many of the sectors that are referenced in the IDP, whether it's transport or health or economy or culture, lots of different ones, do you think will have this plan on their notice board and be referencing it on a frequent basis? Ian, you looked at me, so you can answer that. Peter was wise enough to look down.
Eye contact, what can you do? I think in terms of the sectors, the built environment is an obvious one which will have interest written all over them, because it's a not insignificant sum of investments coming through, and many companies in Scotland, their business model is around procuring from the public sector. And some are totally the opposite, it's private sector only, but most big companies have got big procurement departments in terms of public sector pipeline. So in terms of that particular sector, and bearing in mind that sector will touch on all of the subsectors, so they'll deliver the hospitals, the bridges, the roads, the schools, So they'll look at it more of a kind of, rather than a sector, they'll look at it holistically. Because they'll look at, and a lot of this is to do with experience, isn't it? Because we have companies in Scotland who specialise in schools, for example. So they'll be all over a schools programme because they will have a competitive edge, in their opinion, because of their track record and experience and delivery milestones and that type of thing. So I think from my sector's viewpoint, for most of the sectors in the infrastructure plan, they'll be interested in it, and they will contribute to the delivery of it, more importantly.
Okay, and Peter, since you looked down, we'll just play a wee game. I used to play this game my kids call the yes-no game. I know I anticipate you're going to find this particularly difficult. Just bear with me. John, my colleague John, picked up earlier one of the questions about sufficient detail. But the point of the session was, and it was in the papers, and a quote, is intended to provide a snapshot of how the ITP has been received amongst key sectors. So I'll just ask you a few points and just give me a yes or no. I just want to get a flavour of it. Right, okay, so the first one, the IDP provides certainty for project planning, private sector investment, innovation and skills development to support economic growth. A yes or a no? Certainty is a key point in that.
You can't expect me to give a yes or no answer to that.
I can, and on balance, all things considered.
Question.
I'm just trying to get a flavour. Seriously,
as we've talked about, it gives some people the certainty they need, but quite a lot of people the certainty, not enough certainty and not enough granularity for the planning that they need.
Okay, that was a very good point. Thank you very much for making that. The cost ranges and timescales provided in the accompanying Excel spreadsheet are credible and deliverable.
They can be. They'll all have been put together by experts, but we can't tell for things like inflation what's going to happen in the future. So they're the best available at the minute.
Yeah, so we know that the only time a project plan is accurate is after completion of the project. We've all done enough projects to know that. But what I'm trying to explore is, you know, having looked at the accompanying Excel spreadsheet, it's pretty high level. So the higher the level, the bigger the variance against any initial estimates is going to be.
Agreed.
So do you think the variance could be extremely high because they're very high level?
I would expect that in a number of those projects there will be significant variances by the time you get to outturn,
Yeah, okay. And do you think the draft strategy reflects a sufficiently long-term approach to infrastructure planning? Is it about the right kind of...
I think taken as a whole, yes, because we've got a 30-year what's out there, where are we going, what are the key drivers, the things that we need to think across the system. We've got a 10-year plan, and then we've got what are we going to spend money on in the next 4 years. So you can't really look at the spending much longer than that for obvious reasons. I think maybe there's more work on, in that moving out from the 4 years, how do we then go about prioritising what's going to come next to give a longer term view out there, whilst respecting the sort of democratic processes that have to happen as well.
Yeah, and were you surprised that the prioritisation, for example, is asserted rather than demonstrated, and there's no kind of interdependency assessment, no look at integration, prioritisation, sequencing, capacity assessment, risk management, metrics, spatial strategies, supply chain considerations, governance and so on? Might you have expected to have seen any of that in the plan?
I think that's an area of development, and I think that overall, well, we said that we can use some of the principles, we said in our needs assessment, we can use some of the principles we set out there to get better at long-term prioritisation. Again, you were saying earlier this morning, how do we make our prioritisation decisions to deliver the outcomes that we've said that we want to deliver? And I think there is development work needed in that area. So, for example, I would say that an individual business case for a project should sit within an asset strategy for that sector or that. So, and look at how the service delivery model is going to develop in the future. I use colleges as an example, perhaps, where rather than just a business case for for one new building, what is the long-term service delivery model? What is the asset base that we need to support that delivery model? And then what is the investment we need to get from where we are now to where that's going to be? And that was all work that's going on, but it is a development path to get there. I think you've seen as an infrastructure improvement plan, so we're working with the portfolios on those asset strategies. So there is more work to be done on that.
Yeah. I mean, the reason I'm asking that is I'm trying to flesh out a bit. I mean, on the face of it, this document has lots and lots and lots of things missing, and I would contend that most people won't stick it on their kind of, their notice board. They'll check to see whether something, what's the thematics, if you like. So construction, housing, generally, there's a very clear thread. But what I'm trying to explore is what would be the right balance that pulls in a lot of good work that's clearly underway against the considerable uncertainty. I mean, we talked about a mutual investment model earlier. I mean, that's come onto the table, goes right back to PPE and Meg Hilliard, the Public Audits Committee. Get it off the balance sheet, of UK PLC that's trading broke. And that's where that's come from. So it's probably a necessary reaction to a fundamental lack of capital, which the conveners talked about. So I suppose I'm just trying to flesh out, what do you think could be added to it that makes it more weighty, whilst fully recognising we've got a short-term environment with this year-on-year budget thing, but we're not going to be able to deliver these grand thematics that we need to do.
So I'm a member of the Institution of Civil Engineers. It's my professional body. We have a programme called Enabling Better Infrastructure that works with governments around the world about how to do better long-term infrastructure planning. We're not in a unique situation in Scotland by any means on this, and we've worked with places around the world on that long-term pipeline and then the prioritisation process. We launched an update of that recently. I was very drawn to comments made by Chris Bishop, who's the New Zealand Minister for Infrastructure and Housing, who said that he had campaigned for a long-term infrastructure plan independently developed and the development of parliamentary cross-party consensus on that plan. So the balance that we have to strike is what are the right things for you guys to decide through the political process, through your manifestos, etc., and what is the role of long-term independent advice that says if you want these outcomes, these are the sorts of things that you should be prioritising. And I fully recognise there's a place for both of those elements in long-term infrastructure planning, but I think it's maybe future work for this committee and others to think how you can balance out those two elements to do effectively what Professor Roy was saying this morning, which is to look at the outcomes we want and what are the sorts of things that we should be spending on to deliver against those outcomes, and then what is the evidence about the impact that they have had. So we're very big on collecting the evidence as well. And that's why in our needs assessment we set out some of the themes that we think will be driving infrastructure investment over that longer period of time, so that those could be taken forward and used in a process to help us prioritise what are the things that are making the most difference on these key themes.
Okay, final word, Ian.
Yeah, I think interdependencies are quite important from our viewpoint. We've been working very closely with Westminster in terms of their announcements 18 months ago about the number of new houses, for example, and they said, do we have the workforce to deliver this housing programme? And we said no, because you want to deliver this at the same time as nuclear and rail and all the other big infrastructure projects. So we've been working with them on that workforce interdependency, and how do you address that issue to ensure that everything can get delivered in terms of the time that governments want it to be delivered. So we are establishing with government construction centres of excellence, for example, and these will be introduced on a demand-led model. So when Manchester gets the green light to have the investment to build 150,000 housing units, the construction centre of excellence gets stood up, and there's a whole workforce intervention basically to make sure that the jobs that are required are being trained and going through a pipeline to deliver that housing programme. So it's a different approach than we have at the present time, and it remains to be seen if it will be effective, but it's trying to take away the red flags around interdependency, whereby you want to build all of this infrastructure in the Highlands at the same time as you want to do things like green ports, or you want to do other big infrastructure projects, and you haven't quite worked out, can we deliver this? In many cases it will always be delivered, but if you don't get the workforce planning right, the wage inflation, productivity, timescales can all shift negatively. So I think the earliest you can have that conversation brought in to the plan or to the kind of detail, I think the better.
Okay.
Systems, not silos.
Yeah, indeed. I couldn't agree more. Thanks, Convener.
Patrick.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon. I would like to ask you to reflect on a slightly different perspective on some of this. I don't know, I think you were here for the earlier session, so you may have heard the questions I was asking to the Fiscal Commission about the economic and security risks that come from ecosystem collapse and biodiversity loss. One of the most fundamental reasons why we're living in an era of ecosystem collapse and biodiversity loss is the kind of infrastructure that people have been building for many generations. What we've been building, how we've been building it, and how we've been using it. The consultation that the government produced on their infrastructure strategy at the same time as the pipeline document was published says infrastructure is the set of long-term assets that enable countries, cities and communities to function effectively. Infrastructure is all around us and can be private or public, economic, social or natural. And I'd like to suggest that the element of and the role of natural infrastructure is slightly lost in all of this. Not to take away from the fact that there's a huge amount of importance and value in the stuff that we build, the stuff that we build can come at a cost to the natural infrastructure that we also depend on. And if I look at the projects in the pipeline, the only elements that appear to have any relationship at all to natural infrastructure are also things that we are doing, whether that's peatland restoration or woodland or what have you. It doesn't have any space for or reflection on the natural infrastructure, the infrastructure that nature provides for us, that is already here, and which we too often destroy, degrade or undermine its ability to regenerate itself by the way that we build infrastructure. So why is this dynamic relationship between natural and artificial infrastructure not reflected in some way in the document you produced?
There's a lot in there, Patrick, as you well know. I think, firstly, there's a bit of a definitional question about what is infrastructure, and I don't think we would classify all of the natural environment as infrastructure. I do think that both natural and built infrastructure has an impact on the natural environment that we need to be very cautious of and think more about, frankly. And that's why in our long-term needs assessment we put nature positive as one of the key cross-cutting themes that all of infrastructure sectors need to think more about. And nature positive was very deliberately chosen. And I try to think of that at three levels, really. One is what I would call natural infrastructure itself, so managed environments that provide landscape services rather than all of nature. Now, you might disagree whether that's the right classification or not. So I think how we invest in that and strengthen that to provide, I guess the language is ecosystem services, I suppose, is really important. The second is when we're doing what has traditionally been built infrastructure, how can we make more of nature-based solutions within that built infrastructure? So making more natural flood defences, using run-of-the-river, bringing permeable surfaces in, just a few examples. So we can get better, I think, about using natural elements in our built infrastructure, even natural materials in our buildings. And the third element is access to nature as we're thinking about our built environment and particularly our social infrastructure overall. So are we giving our young people access to the outdoors properly in our schools so that they value nature properly into the future. So whilst we can have a definitional discussion about what is natural infrastructure, for me, thinking about nature positivity at all of those levels, what we're prioritising, how we're bringing nature-based solutions into our built environment and access to nature are things that we can do. And I hope that we can do more of that in the future. I'm not necessarily saying whether we're doing enough or not enough, but I think it's something we can definitely focus on and do more of.
I'm not suggesting that we get into a kind of philosophical debate about the definition of what counts as infrastructure, but I would suggest that if we continue what we're doing very effectively about wiping out pollinators around the world, which we depend on for our food system, and some tech bro comes along saying, I can do that artificially, they would very, very quickly get governments to accept that the machinery they're developing would be classed as infrastructure, and it would be an infrastructure priority, even though it's only needed because we've wiped out something that was doing it much more effectively in the first place. Can I suggest that the problem isn't just what's in the current document, but the model of a pipeline, the metaphor of a pipeline is the wrong way to think about this. Makes absolute sense if you're seeing it from the perspective of someone who makes their living from building stuff, and that's important. But if we're seeing it from the other end of the telescope, the perspective of what does our society need, what is that set of assets that our society needs, we should be looking more at a hierarchy of needs. That most fundamentally we need clean air to breathe, clean water, shelter. Moving on, we want to have a functional society, sewage systems, we want healthcare systems, we want an element of transport infrastructure to have a modern economy, and ultimately at the highest, the least fundamental, but the more aspirational end, we might want to replace fast internet with super fast internet. But that's a nice to have rather than a fundamental need, and that we never degrade something that provides fundamental needs in order to achieve something that's at the lower end of the hierarchy. Should we not conceive of it in those terms rather than just a pipeline of what we're going to build?
So I see those as two different things, and I think both are important, because all the people that deal with delivery, as you said, need to know, for all the reasons we've just talked about, what's coming, when, etc., etc. I think what you're talking about, if I may, is how do we go about our prioritisation that takes things from being ideas or something that someone particularly wants in that top sort of bit of the funnel into the pipeline? What's our prioritisation methodology? And I think what you're arguing for very reasonably is a set of criteria that you might apply to ideas and thoughts to prioritise them for investment. And other people will have different ideas about what are the right sort of hierarchy of things to prioritise. And yours sounded like a great list. And what we could do is have more of a mechanism where we look at, across all of the different sectors, all of the different project or investment options, and run them through a prioritisation methodology that says, if it is a negative on one of the things that we really want to deliver for our country, then either it doesn't get funded at all, or it goes right down the list. If it's highly positive on something that we really, really value, because you can't just have criteria, you need to have weightings and all of those sorts of things, then you would prioritise it. So I would agree with you that overall prioritisation methodology and the transparency around it is a really important thing that links the outcomes that we want for the country to what we invest in.
But does it happen before a particular project ends up in this pipeline document or moving from Annex B into Annex A?
So I think what I've said is that there are individual business cases for individual projects, but I think we can get better at using things like our needs assessment and others to say overall for the country, what are the outcomes we want, and therefore what would you prioritise against any given set of criteria to get there. I think we can do better at that, and that is a sort of a line of improvement I think that everybody would probably want to see.
Okay, thank you.
So that has concluded our questions, but just before we finish, I want to ask if there are any points that either of our guests would like to cover that they feel we haven't touched on in our questioning this morning. If there's any final words you wish to say.
No, happy, thank you very much.
You okay, Ian?
Very happy. Thank you very much.
Both taking the fifth? Okay, that's fine. Well, I want to thank you very much. I actually found your evidence extremely helpful. I thought it was really effective, and we'll be taking evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance, and no doubt a number of the issues that we've discussed with you today will come forth from that. So thank you very much. I'm just going to call a 2-minute break, colleagues, to allow our witnesses and official report and broadcasting to leave.